For centuries, the powerful didn't write their history, they carved it in stone. They left behind a trail of glyphs, sigils, and motifs that tell a story of wealth, danger, and divinity. But somewhere along the way, we forgot how to read them. Today, we are opening the Encyclopedia of Stone to reveal the forbidden and hidden meanings behind the world's most beautiful and mysterious architecture. The Unseen City, decoding the silent whispers of the cornerstone. We live in the unseen city, a place where the architecture is not merely shelter, but a massive public text written in a hidden language of stone. And if you want to understand that language, you must start where the builders began, at the very first stone laid. You must begin with the cornerstone. Every great structure, from the humblest colonial church to the most powerful seat of government in Washington, D.C., began with this single solemn act. The laying of the cornerstone was never just construction, it was a ritual, it was a promise. It was the moment a building, and often the entire civic ideal it represented, was symbolically born. And in the early days of the American Republic, these ceremonies were fraught with coded meaning, filled with symbols and artifacts meant to speak volumes to the future, even if that language is deafeningly silent to us today. What did those master builders whisper to the stone before the mortar set? What hopes, or perhaps what warnings, did they seal into the bedrock of American life? The ritual of sealing the secret. To modern eyes, a cornerstone is just a big block of rock. But to the architects and societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, it was the structural and spiritual anchor of the entire edifice. It was always laid with great pomp, usually on the northeast corner, symbolically facing the dawn of the new day. The public ritual involved three key tools, tools still familiar to anyone who has seen the symbolism of Freemasonry: the square of morality, the level of equality, and the plumb line of rectitude. These tools weren't just for alignment, they were instruments of philosophical declaration. When the master of the ceremony used them, he wasn't just checking that the stone was straight. He was ritually blessing the moral and structural integrity of the structure, and by extension, the community it served. But the truly fascinating element of the cornerstone is not what sits on top, but what lies beneath it or concealed within a hollowed out cavity. This is the time capsule, a tradition that predates the modern concept by centuries. It wasn't just a nostalgic gesture, it was a way of establishing a historical and ideological lineage. Imagine the scene. Under the gaze of the townsfolk and dignitaries, a copper box is lowered into the foundation. It contains the standard artifacts: current coins of the realm, a marker of economic stability, newspapers detailing the events of the day, the recorded history, and often a holy book, the moral compass. But then come the less publicized items. The architect or the presiding fraternal order would often include items that served as a secret declaration of their own beliefs. A small lead or bronze plate inscribed not just with the date, but with astrological alignments or the numerical equivalent of the building's dimensions tied into ancient Pythagorean geometry. These weren't intended for the casual historian of the future. They were intended for the initiated, a silent communication across centuries, confirming their enduring influence. For example, in many early American civic buildings, from New York City Hall to dozens of small town courthouses, the engraved symbols on the ceremony's tools, if you look closely at the surviving documentation, are not just the generic tools of construction. They are often highly stylized, sometimes featuring an eye within a triangle or a starburst composed of precise points, each element speaking volumes about the philosophical bent of the builders and funders. Case study: The Stone Secrets of the Federal City. Nowhere is this hidden language more powerful than in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Very geometry of the city is an architectural declaration, but let's look closer at the foundation of American democracy, the United States Capitol building. The cornerstone ceremony for the Capitol, held in 1793, was a legendary event shrouded in intentional layers of meaning. George Washington, then the sitting president, presided. While this was a great civic event, it was also explicitly a Masonic ritual. Washington himself wore a Masonic apron and carried a silver trowel, tools that were deeply symbolic of the building trade and the moral duties of the builder. The cornerstone itself, now unseen beneath layers of marble, was reportedly inscribed with multiple cryptic markings. Beyond the names and dates, historical records suggest the stone bore symbols related to solar alignment and the cyclical nature of time, symbols derived not from Christianity, but from classical and esoteric traditions. The message sealed into that foundation was clear. The American experiment was being built not just on revolutionary politics, but on principles drawn from the Enlightenment's fascination with antiquity and secret knowledge. This isn't a theory of conspiracy, it's a study of architectural rhetoric. The use of these symbols was a way for the founders, many of whom were Masons, to infuse the state structure with their ideals of universal truth, reason, and perfectibility. The silent whisper of that cornerstone asserts that the governance of the nation should be guided by moral geometry and eternal universal laws, not transient political fashion. Think also of the Washington Monument. Its cornerstone ceremony, though delayed by decades, followed the same pattern. The sheer volume of symbolic artifacts, Bibles, constitutions, and relics sealed within it turns it into an architectural library. But the monument itself is an obelisk, a form pulled straight from ancient Egypt, an almost impossible piece of geometry. Why did they choose a symbol of Egyptian eternity to mark the legacy of a new republic? The cornerstone whispers the answer: to signify that this foundation and the values it upheld were meant to be eternal, like the monuments of the pharaohs. Boston and the Puritan precedents. It wasn't just the federal government using this practice. Travel north to Boston, a city whose history is literally built on the shifting sands of revolution and industry. Here, the symbolism is often more Puritan, more austere, yet equally intentional. In colonial churches and meeting houses, structures that served as both religious centers and town halls, the cornerstone often held a Bible and sometimes simply the year, carved in bold, unwavering Roman numerals. But look closer at the materials. The stone itself, often granite or local quarry rock, was meant to project the steadfast, unyielding morality of the community. Where the symbols weren't hidden in a cavity, they were carved right onto the stone. You might find a simple anchor, a symbol of hope, security, and stability in the face of life's turbulent seas, a crucial motif for a seafaring and trade-reliant town. You might see a beehive on the foundation of an early bank or civic organization, a clear, powerful message about the necessity of industry, order, and collective labor. These aren't random decorations. These are architectural shorthand. When the citizens of 1800 looked at the cornerstone of their new town hall and saw the beehive, they were reminded by the very structure of the building of the civic virtue required to keep the town prosperous. The cornerstone, therefore, was not just the foundation for the building, it was the foundation of the community's behavioral expectations. The hidden language of numbers and alignment. The language of the cornerstone extends beyond imagery, it delves into mathematics. The Enlightenment era was obsessed with Pythagorean and Platonic ideals, believing that the universe was governed by numerical harmony. This belief was translated directly into the stone. The architect, often steeped in classical theory, would ensure that the building's proportions, the height of the walls, the span of the arches, the number of steps, adhered to specific symbolic ratios. The cornerstone, holding the blueprint of these hidden dimensions, became the key to unlocking this numerical code. Consider the number 3. It represents the perfect structural form, the triangle, and held deep symbolic meaning in both religious and esoteric traditions Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or wisdom, strength, and beauty in Masonic philosophy. You might find that the cornerstone was laid exactly 3 paces from the nearest permanent object, or that the dedication was conducted using 3 distinct strikes of the hammer. These seemingly minor details were intentional affirmations of the building's philosophical grounding. Furthermore, the alignment of the cornerstone itself frequently carried hidden meaning. While typically northeast, its exact orientation was sometimes adjusted to align with a specific celestial event, perhaps the rising sun on the summer solstice, or the moment the moon reached a certain degree of its cycle. This was not structural engineering. This was cosmic engineering, an attempt to pull the vast, ordered power of the universe into the fixed, finite structure on Earth. The cornerstone was the ritualistic conductor of that energy. The final whisper. We stand today in cities where skyscrapers dwarf these humble foundational stones, where glass and steel have replaced granite and marble. The language of the architects has become one of efficiency and function, forgetting the deep symbolic roots of form and material. But the cornerstone endures. It is the final, unmovable testament to the original intent. When a structure is demolished, when a city undergoes 1,000 transformations, the cornerstone is often the last piece of the past to be uncovered. A silent archive, a sealed letter from the men and women who shaped the American landscape. What does it tell us? It tells us that our ancestors didn't just build homes and banks, they built philosophical monuments. They didn't just lay stones, they planted ideas. And they did so with a hidden language of symbols the anchor, the beehive, the plum, and the all seeing eye. Each one whispering a coded message about the true nature of power, faith, and community. To decode the unseen city, you must learn to read this language. You must move past the visible facade and acknowledge the secrets buried just beneath the surface. Because once you start noticing these symbols, once you understand the power sealed into that very first stone, you will realize that the hidden history of America is literally supporting your feet, waiting for you to look down and finally decipher its meaning. And the language of the cornerstone is just the beginning. Next, we will trace these hidden symbols back across the Atlantic to the secret guilds and master builders who first invented this silent, powerful vocabulary. 2. The master builder's handshake. How medieval guilds coded their power in stone. This was the age of stone. It was a time when faith was carved into the sky, and the only limit to a city's ambition was the height of its spire. To raise these colossal cathedrals, these impenetrable castles, and these vast city walls required more than just labor. It required secrets. These secrets, the geometry of the flying buttress, the perfect mortar mix, the trick to carving a self-supporting arch, were too valuable to write down. They represented power, wealth, and the very stability of a kingdom. They were not taught in universities. They were guarded fiercely by exclusive traveling societies, the operative masons. These were the original master builders, and their language was the silent, ubiquitous code we are only just beginning to read again today. The necessity of the secret society. In the medieval world, the stonemason was not just a laborer, he was an artist, an engineer, and a philosopher. Cathedral projects could last centuries, spanning multiple generations of a single family of stoneworkers. These workers were itinerant. They had to be. They followed the work, moving across kingdoms and across linguistic barriers. This constant travel created a profound challenge. How do you prove your skill? How do you distinguish a highly trained master from a local unskilled peasant looking for work? There was no official degree, no universal certification. Your life and the lives of those who stood beneath your stone arches depended on trust. The answer was the guild system. These guilds were more than just unions. They were exclusive schools, banks, insurance agencies, and secret societies all rolled into one. And they created a system of communication, the master builder's handshake, to protect the integrity of their trade. The secrets were not about what they built, but how they built it. If a competitor, or worse, an enemy state, could figure out the structural secrets of vaulting a cathedral ceiling or designing a castle wall that defied cannon fire, the power of the original builders was lost. The trade was protected by vows of silence and by an elaborate nonverbal language. This language had two layers: the visible language of philosophical morality and the hidden language of technical expertise. Decoding the tools of the trade. When the master mason traveled to a new lodge, a temporary stone workshop near the building site, he carried his tools. And these simple, practical instruments were the alphabet of his secret language. The same tools we saw symbolically laid at the American cornerstone ceremonies were, for the medieval mason, the keys to their entire moral and professional existence. The square. This was the paramount tool. It ensures accuracy and right angles. Symbolically, it demanded morality and rectitude. You must act on the square, meaning your life, like your stone cuts, must be true, honest, and just. In an era where contracts and agreements were often verbal, the square was a constant reminder of the builder's moral obligation to his client and his craft. The compasses. Used to draw circles and arcs, the compasses controlled the boundaries of the design. Symbolically, they represented self-control and discipline. The mason was taught to keep his desires and actions within due bounds. The two legs of the compasses represented the limits of human ambition and the infinite nature of divine geometry. The plumb and level. These tools confirmed verticality and horizontality. Symbolically, they spoke of equality and divine order. Every man, regardless of his title in the outside world, stood on the level within the lodge. The plumb line was a constant reminder that judgment, from God or the community, requires straightness, without deviation. These tools, often etched on the ceremonial records or seals of the guilds, were a universally recognizable code. A mason from France could present himself in Italy, show the intricate design of his tools, and instantly confirm his bona fides, his grade, and his allegiance to the universal principles of the craft. The hidden hand, mason marks and banker marks. But the secret language wasn't just philosophical, it was intensely practical. Every single stone block used in a major construction project, and there could be tens of thousands, had to be identified. Imagine a construction site the size of a modern city block with hundreds of stonecutters working simultaneously. How did the master mason know who carved which stone? And how could the treasury know who to pay? The answer lay in the mason mark, also known as the banker mark. As the stonecutters finished the block, they didn't sign it with their full name. They signed it with a small, often stylized geometric symbol, a personal glyph, that only they and the guild master recognized. This was the mark of the worker, carved with purpose, ensuring quality control and proper payment. It was the medieval equivalent of a barcode or a timestamp. These marks are the true hidden language of forgotten architectural symbols. Most of them are concealed. They are often found on the interior face of the stone, the part that rests against the mortar or the wall. They were never meant for public display, only for the eyes of the guild.
However, sometimes these personalized marks were given such significance or style that they became part of the building's aesthetic, appearing on window ledges or near doorways, a subtle, almost arrogant declaration of the stoneworker's identity. Finding a cluster of identical marks on a cathedral means one specific master and his team built that entire section. It is a signature enduring through 1,000 years. The complexity of these marks was a secret in itself. They weren't random doodles. They often incorporated elements of the symbolic tools, the triangle of the compasses, the right angle of the square, but simplified and abstracted. Only by knowing the key, the system of the local lodge, could one truly read who had performed the work. This enforced loyalty and disciplined labor. If a stone failed structurally 50 years later, the mark told the organization exactly which man was responsible, ensuring accountability across generations. The sacred geometry, protecting the trade secrets. Beyond the marks, the guilds protected structural secrets that were literally groundbreaking. The Gothic style, in particular, was an architectural miracle, pushing stone to its absolute limit with ribbed vaults, pointed arches, and the revolutionary flying buttress. The secret to these features was geometry, specifically sacred geometry, a branch of mathematics where builders used shapes like the circle and the triangle to create designs they believed were dictated by divine law. The formulas for constructing the perfect arch, for calculating the precise thrust and counterthrust needed for a tall spire, or for ensuring the stability of a giant dome were never published. They were memorized, passed down orally, and then encoded into the architecture itself. For instance, the precise angle of a certain vault might not be explicitly stated in any blueprint. Instead, the builder might use a symbolic ratio derived from the Pythagorean theorem, which was known and used by masons long before it was widely taught in universities. The proportions of the overall facade, the length and width of the nave, might follow the golden ratio, a concept believed to represent perfect beauty and harmony. The building itself became a massive, functioning cipher. This mastery of hidden mathematics gave the operative masons immense power. They were not just laborers, they were the guardians of ancient knowledge, knowledge that bridged the gap between the earthly structure and the divine ideal. From operative stone to speculative thought. The medieval period waned, and the necessity of traveling, operative guilds began to fade. The great cathedral building era slowed, and formal architecture began to be taught in academic schools, eroding the guild's monopoly on knowledge. But the secret language, the symbols, and the philosophical rituals did not die. They merely changed hands in a process known as the transition from operative to speculative masonry. As the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, the guilds began admitting men who were not stonecutters,
intellectuals, nobles, clergy, and scientists, men who were fascinated by the moral philosophy and the ancient geometry of the craft. They were interested in not building stone walls, but in building a better society. They wanted to use the tools symbolically to guide their own moral conduct. The square and compass were no longer just tools for cutting rock, but became emblems for self-improvement and fraternal loyalty. The old practical secrets of stone were transformed into the ethical secrets of man. It was this newly organized, philosophical, and intensely private version of the Builders Guild, Freemasonry, that crossed the Atlantic and landed on the shores of the New World. When we see George Washington or Paul Revere or Benjamin Franklin dressed in their ceremonial aprons, ritually laying the cornerstone of a new American institution, they were not just paying homage to democracy, they were performing an act steeped in 1,000 years of European tradition. They were the inheritors of the master builder's handshake. The secrets that protected a medieval guild's trade, the coded marks on the stones, the symbolic geometry of the cathedral's height, were now being used to found a nation. The tools of the operative mason became the moral blueprint for the American Republic. The cornerstone, laid in silence and secrecy in the New World, was simply the final powerful chapter in a story that began centuries earlier, high on the scaffolding of a towering Gothic spire. The secrets of the guilds once used to build cathedrals were now building continents. In our next section, we will see how these symbols were adapted for American power, specifically focusing on the most enduring and debated symbols of all, the serpent and the Ouroboros.
Number 3. The serpent and the Ouroboros, symbols of eternity hidden in plain sight on Capitol Hill. When these architects and founders began designing Washington, D.C., the city of ideals, they moved beyond the simple tools of the builder. They needed symbols that could express concepts far grander and more complex than rectitude and morality. They needed symbols for power, for continuity, and most controversially, for eternity. The stage for this declaration was Capitol Hill, and the symbols they chose were ancient, potent, and utterly pagan, the serpent and the Ouroboros. Why in a fledgling Christian republic would the most visible structures of government be riddled with symbols linked to mythology, alchemy, and the oldest mysteries of the world? The answer is found in the architectural rhetoric of the Enlightenment. The founders looked past the Bible and deep into classical antiquity, seeking symbols of universal, cyclical truth that transcended temporary political or religious loyalties. The ultimate controversial motif. The serpent is perhaps the ultimate divisive symbol in the Western world. To some, it is the tempter, the villain of Eden, representing temptation, chaos, and deceit. Yet, for thousands of years before Christianity, the serpent was revered as a guardian of knowledge, a healer, and a symbol of immortality because of its ability to shed its skin and be reborn. When architects like Pierre L'Enfant and Bulfinch laid out the plans for the federal city, they were not thinking of Adam and Eve. They were thinking of Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine, whose rod was wrapped by a healing serpent, and the protective cobras of Egyptian pharaohs. They incorporated the serpent not as a warning against sin, but as an affirmation of wisdom and protection. But no serpent symbol is more profound or more revealing of the founders' philosophical aspirations for the Republic than the Ouroboros. The snake that eats itself, an emblem of perpetual renewal. The Ouroboros is the serpent or dragon devouring its own tail, forming a perfect circle. Its name comes from the Greek words aura and boros, meaning tail eater.
This symbol, traceable back to ancient Egypt, where it represented the sun's cyclical journey and rebirth, resonated profoundly with the Enlightenment thinkers. It represents perpetuity. It is the ultimate architectural statement of cyclical self-renewal. The Ouroboros encapsulates the concept of eternal return, the unity of beginnings and endings. The constant act of consuming oneself is not destruction, but a necessary process of rejuvenation. In a political context, the message sealed into the stone is this: the Republic must perpetually renew itself to survive. It must consume its old forms, its mistakes, and its inefficiencies, only to be reborn stronger, ensuring that the government is an unbroken, self-sustaining entity. Where can you find this powerful symbol? While often subtle, the Ouroboros can be seen in the architectural seals and decorative motifs that adorn Capitol Hill, especially those associated with knowledge, documentation, and the endless work of the legislative branch. It is found integrated into cartouches, wrapped around clocks or scales, symbolizing the eternal nature of time and justice, or surrounding the central figures of classical gods. The architects did not carve it in isolation. They often paired it with other symbols to sharpen its meaning. With the phoenix, it symbolizes rebirth from ashes. The Ouroboros is the process of renewal. The phoenix is the result. With the staff of Hermes, it signifies the commercial and financial continuity of the state. A philosophical declaration of the Republic. For the highly educated men who designed and funded early American federal buildings, the Ouroboros was a perfect rhetorical device for the new experiment in democracy. Democracy, by its nature, is chaotic and messy. It's constantly dissolving and reforming itself through elections, constitutional amendments, and political debate. Unlike a monarchy, which is supposedly linear and hereditary, the Republic needed a symbol of its own self-generating continuity. The Ouroboros offered that. It suggested a form of government that, through its constitutional framework, was designed to be its own engine of survival, eating away corruption and obsolescence to maintain its perfect circular form. This was a declaration against the perceived weakness of previous republics, which eventually collapsed from internal rot or external pressures. By carving the Ouroboros into the marble of its most essential civic structures, the founders made an architectural wish: may this republic be eternal. The controversial interpretation, the hidden faith. Of course, the use of such a profoundly esoteric symbol did not pass without controversy, and it is here that the concept of the hidden language intersects with modern debate. The Ouroboros has deep historical ties to traditions that diverge sharply from mainstream Western theology. It was a key symbol in Gnosticism, ancient philosophical and religious systems that emphasized spiritual knowledge, gnosis, over orthodox faith. It also featured prominently in alchemy, where it represented the circular, transformative work of nature and the goal of unifying opposites, the volatile and the fixed. When modern audiences, particularly those unfamiliar with 18th century classical education, encounter the Ouroboros on Capitol Hill, they often interpret it through a lens of secret societies and occult manipulation. This isn't necessarily proof of a conspiracy, but rather proof of a philosophical clash. The founders, products of the Enlightenment, were often more comfortable with universal, geometric, and mythic symbols drawn from ancient Greece and Rome than with exclusively Christian iconography. Their goal was to create a pluralistic society, and their architecture reflected this desire for philosophical inclusiveness, using symbols that spoke to reason and timelessness rather than sectarian faith.
The controversy stems from the fact that the secret language of the architects was so effective that it became too obscure. The symbols they carved for posterity were eventually forgotten by the very populace they were meant to enlighten, leaving them open to suspicion and misinterpretation. The serpent's other guises, Caduceus and Asclepius. To further understand the symbolic power of the serpent in DC, we must distinguish between the self-consuming Ouroboros and its two related, more practical cousins, the Caduceus and the rod of Asclepius. The rod of Asclepius, a single serpent winding around a staff, is the ancient Greek symbol of healing and medicine. You find this on medical buildings, hospitals, and often in Veterans Affairs architecture, symbolizing the state's duty to health. The caduceus, two serpents intertwined around a winged staff, belongs to the Roman god Mercury, Greek Hermes, the god of commerce, negotiation, and messages. This symbol is ubiquitous on the architecture of U.S. financial institutions, Federal Reserve buildings, and even some military units, where it represents speed and communication. Its presence in the federal city underscores the fact that the republic is built on economic continuity as much as political perpetuity. The key point is that the architects of the federal city were masters of this symbolic taxonomy. They used the specific version of the snake, the single-coiled, tail-eating snake, to convey eternity and renewal, reserving the other snake forms for commerce and health. Every coil, every staff, every wing was a deliberate choice, a word in the forgotten architectural language. Guardians in stone, the serpent of wisdom. Finally, the serpent in architecture often serves as a guardian. In many cultures, the serpent, living both above and below ground, was believed to have intimate knowledge of the earth's secrets and mineral wealth. In the context of the Capitol building and the Library of Congress, the subtle serpentine motifs operate as sentinels guarding the nation's treasures, its laws, its historical archives, and its collective knowledge. It is a symbol that suggests the secrets contained within these walls are protected by ancient wisdom. This protective role is critical to the founders' vision. They believed the Republic's greatest defense was not its army, but its institutions and its adherence to self-evident eternal truths. The symbols they carved into the stone of Capitol Hill, especially the Ouroboros, are not merely decorative, they are ideological fortifications. The Ouroboros stands as the definitive testament to the founders' greatest hope, that the American experiment would achieve the sacred perfection of the circle, a system that sustains itself forever. It is a symbol that asks the American people to look past the political squabbles of the day and remember the high-minded, cosmic ideal sealed into the bedrock of the federal city. The serpent and the Ouroboros are not tokens of a hidden cult. They are the most profound statement the first American architects could make about the immortality of the Republic. Final shot holds on an etched Ouroboros slowly rotating before dissolving into a clean, classical facade. We have seen the secretive language of the guilds and the eternal language of the Ouroboros. But how did these concepts turn into the massive, imposing structures of power? Next, we will explore the deliberate choice of design, from Roman temples to federal banks, the classical language of power and virtue. 04. From Roman temples to federal banks, the classical language of power and virtue. Now we confront the architectural language of declaration, the language meant to be understood instantly and universally by the American public. This is the language of the column, the pediment, and the dome. This is neoclassicism. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as America sought to define itself against the decadent monarchies of Europe, its founders did not look to the castles of kings or the spires of medieval cathedrals. They looked 2,000 years into the past, to the birthplace of democracy in Athens and the republican virtue of Rome. This was a deliberate, powerful choice. The architectural style itself was the first and most enduring political statement of the new nation. We are not a kingdom, we are a republic, rooted in the liberty and civic virtue of the ancients. The tyranny of the pyramid versus the ideal of the temple. To understand why America chose the classical template, we must first understand what it was rejecting. The architecture of European power was often Gothic or Baroque, structures that were highly ornamental, asymmetrical, and built on a vertical axis, always pointing to a king or a god above. The most extreme symbol of absolute, centralized authority was the pyramid, where all power culminates at a single, inaccessible point. The classical temple, however, operates on a horizontal axis. It is built on a simple rectangle, resting firmly on the ground, projecting symmetry, balance, and rationality. This difference was a revolution in stone. The vertical monarchy implied hierarchy and dependence on divine right. The horizontal republic implied equality, balance, and dependence on human reason and law. The American architects, many of whom were educated in the classical liberal arts, saw the neoclassical style not just as aesthetically pleasing, but as morally correct. It was the visual equivalent of the Constitution, a rational, balanced, and deliberately structured framework for organizing power. Decoding the columns, the orders of virtue. The most recognizable feature of this classical language is the column. It is not merely a support structure, it is the visual personification of the state's intended character. Early American architecture overwhelmingly employed three classical orders, each carrying a distinct symbolic weight. Number one, Doric, the column of strength and simplicity. Close up on the plain, fluted shaft and the simple, square capital of a Doric column, for example, the Lincoln Memorial. This is the oldest, simplest, and most robust Greek order. In America, the Doric column represented the pure, unyielding strength and foundational simplicity of the revolutionary spirit. It was often used on federal buildings that required the projection of enduring, almost rustic virtue, like early mints or military academies. Number two, Ionic, the column of wisdom and law. Close up on the Ionic capital with its distinctive twin scrolls, volutes, for example, the U.S. Treasury Building. More graceful than the Doric column, the Ionic column featured scrolls resembling coiled parchment. This order symbolized wisdom, reason, and the rule of law. It was perfectly suited for courthouses, libraries, and crucially, institutions managing the nation's wealth and administration, like the U.S. Treasury Building. The scrolls suggested written documents and rational thought guiding governance. Number three, Corinthian, the column of prosperity and abundance. Close up on the highly ornate Corinthian capital, decorated with acanthus thieves, for example, the U.S. Capitol interior. This was the most ornate and visually rich order, symbolizing wealth, sophistication, and national prosperity. It was often reserved for the most important ceremonial spaces, like the interior rotunda of the Capitol, signifying that the new republic was not merely frugal and simple, but capable of achieving cultural and economic abundance. The architects did not mix these carelessly. They were using them as a semantic scale. A bank built with heavy Doric columns was stating its integrity and strength. A library built with Ionic columns was affirming the primacy of intellect. And a grand public hall featuring Corinthian columns was celebrating the nation's success. The pediment, a moral billboard. Above the columns rests the triangular pediment. This structure, often seen crowning the front of classical American buildings, was the equivalent of a modern billboard, a space reserved for the most important symbolic message. The scenes sculpted within these pediments almost always depict allegories of civic virtue. You will rarely find images of specific battles or generals. Instead, you find figures representing justice, blindfolded, holding the scales.
Industry, often holding a hammer or working a loom. Peace, sometimes holding an olive branch. The triumph of commerce, showing abundance in trade. The pediment's message was nonpartisan and timeless. It visually instructed the citizen. This building exists for the pursuit of these universal virtues. It framed the work happening inside the structure, whether making laws or printing money, as a moral obligation rooted in the enduring principles of the Republic. The dome, unifying the state and the cosmos. Perhaps the most potent piece of classical geometry adapted by the New Republic was the dome. From the Pantheon in Rome to the central feature of the U.S. Capitol, the dome is the architectural symbol of unity and cosmic order. By placing the dome, a perfect half sphere, over the central rotunda of a civic structure, the architects were making two crucial claims. One, unity. The circle and the dome represent perfection, equality, and wholeness. The dome unifies the entire legislative body beneath a single, all-encompassing canopy, symbolizing the unity of the states and the sovereign will of the people. 2. Cosmic order. It represents the vault of heaven. Inside the rotunda, the dome connects the work of the earthly government to the ordered, rational, and eternal laws of the universe, a direct nod to the Enlightenment belief that governance should reflect natural law. The sheer, breathtaking scale of these domes was intended to inspire awe, not for a monarch, but for the concept of the republic itself. It was meant to make the citizen feel small, not in comparison to a king, but in comparison to the vast, timeless ideal of a self-governing people. From temple of God to temple of finance. This classical language was not restricted to government. The aesthetic of power and virtue quickly filtered down to institutions of commerce, establishing the architectural pedigree of American capitalism. Look at the old federal banks, the stock exchanges, and the grand post offices built throughout the 19th century. They almost universally borrowed the temple facade. Why would a bank look like a Roman temple? Because the classical style immediately communicated three things vital to commerce. 1. Trust. The thick, Doric columns and symmetrical design conveyed stability, permanence, and security. Your money is safe here. 2. Integrity. The philosophical association with Roman civic virtue implied that the institution operated honestly and on the square. We are moral stewards of your wealth. 3. Lineage. It linked American commerce not to the unpredictable, risk-taking merchant, but to the noble and established tradition of Roman trade and law. The use of neoclassicism in finance was an explicit effort to inject moral authority into monetary transactions. The architectural message was, wealth in a republic must be managed with the same virtue and rationality that govern the state. The enduring legacy, an unwritten promise. The founders and early architects were not just styling buildings, they were engaging in an immense nationwide project of civic education. Every column, every pediment, every dome was a lesson in citizenship, a reminder that the new republic was founded not on whim, but on principles inherited from the height of human civilization. Today, we take this architecture for granted. We might simply call it old or traditional, but when you next walk past a Treasury building or a massive, columned courthouse, try to read the message its builders left. The Doric columns are the promise of strength. The Ionic scrolls are the promise of law. The pediment is the billboard of virtue, and the dome is the guarantee of unity and eternal purpose. This is the classical language of power. It is an unwritten promise, sealed in stone, asking every American to live up to the noble, rational, and virtuous ideals that they decided to carve right into the face of the Republic. The architects used these grand designs to declare the spirit of the Republic. But what about the more mystical symbols, like the all seeing eye, that were meant to remind the observer of the hidden forces at work? Next, we will open the file on the all seeing eye, tracing the journey from Egyptian myth to the American dollar bill.
'05. The All-Seeing Eye. Tracing the journey from Egyptian myth to the American dollar bill. It is the all-seeing eye, the single, radiant eye, often enclosed within a triangle, hovering above an unfinished pyramid. How did this powerful, almost mystical motif, a symbol found in the rituals of ancient Egypt and the secret halls of medieval fraternities, become stamped onto the official currency of the world's foremost secular power? The story of the all-seeing eye is a masterclass in the architectural language of power, a single, potent image meant to convey divine sanction, rational vigilance, and the enduring destiny of the American experiment. The ancient Genesis, the eyes of the pharaohs. To understand the American interpretation, we must trace the symbol back to its primordial source, nearly 5 millennia ago, on the banks of the Nile. In ancient Egyptian mythology, two crucial ocular symbols dominated the spiritual landscape: the Eye of Ra and the Eye of Horus, the Wajat Eye. Both represented cosmic consciousness, but the Wajat Eye in particular was the ultimate symbol of protection, restoration, and holistic completeness. After the god Horus lost his eye in battle, it was magically restored, making it the perfect emblem for healing, safeguarding the throne, and ensuring the cyclical renewal of life. The pharaohs used this eye as an architectural and personal protective talisman, believing it guarded them from chaos and ensured the stability of the kingdom. It was frequently depicted on sarcophagi and temples, guarding the hidden secrets and sacred treasures within. This concept, an unblinking supernatural eye that governs and protects, never vanished. It migrated through trade routes and philosophical exchange into the classical world, maintaining its association with knowledge and guardianship. The Renaissance and the rise of Providence. The symbol resurfaced strongly during the European Renaissance, but its meaning was adapted for the emerging Christian and humanist worldview. It became the Eye of Providence, representing the divine, ever-vigilant surveillance of God over mankind. It was typically enclosed in a triangle, a Trinitarian symbol representing the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The rays emanating from the eye symbolize divine illumination, or the light of revelation and reason that God shines upon the world. During the Age of Enlightenment, this religious interpretation broadened. The eye became the symbol of reason and intellectual vigilance. It suggested that a society governed by the light of reason, rather than the darkness of ignorance, would be under a form of secular grace. The Masonic connection, the great architect. It is impossible to discuss the all-seeing eye in American architecture without addressing its deep, explicit link to Freemasonry. As we explored in earlier sections, Freemasonry was the philosophical inheritor of the operative guilds, using the tools of the builder as moral metaphors. For Masons, the all-seeing eye represents the great architect of the universe. In this context, the eye is not tied to any single religious doctrine. It is a universal representation of the divine presence that observes and rewards all human endeavor,
urging the initiate to live justly because he is perpetually under inspection. Every Mason who swore an oath in a lodge did so under the gaze of the all-seeing eye, a constant reminder of the moral accountability required by their craft. When the men who led the revolution, men like Washington, Franklin, and many architects of the Capitol, embraced the eye, they brought with them this Masonic understanding, a belief in a rational, observing force that holds human institutions accountable. It was a perfect, non-sectarian symbol for secular government founded on natural law and deistic principles. The American adoption, the Great Seal of 1782. The ultimate institutionalization of the all-seeing eye occurred in 1782 with the adoption of the Great Seal of the United States. The process of designing the seal was laborious, involving 3 separate committees over 6 years. The first 2 committees, including figures like Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, produced complex and ultimately rejected designs. It was the third committee, which relied heavily on the artistic and heraldic advice of Charles Thomson, Secretary of the Continental Congress, that finalized the design. The reverse side of the seal, the side that holds the eye, is a deliberate work of architectural rhetoric. It contains 3 distinct elements that form a singular, potent message. 1. The unfinished pyramid. The pyramid, an ancient symbol of strength, endurance, and hierarchy, is deliberately shown as unfinished. This represents the nascent state of the republic. The structure of the nation is solid, but its work is ongoing. It signifies that the work of building the nation is perpetual and requires the continued labor of its people. The foundation stones, numbered MDCC 76, declare the year of independence, 1776. 2. The all-seeing eye. Floating in a triangle above the capstone, the eye is the capstone that was rejected by the builders, a direct reference to the Bible's stone the builders rejected. It suggests that while human work, the pyramid, is imperfect and incomplete, it is perpetually overseen by a higher authority, ensuring the project's destiny. 3. The mottos. 2 Latin mottos seal the message. 1. Annuitas coptis, above the eye, meaning He, God or Providence, has approved our undertakings. This links the success of the revolution directly to the sanction of the eye. 2. Novus Ordo Seclorum, below the pyramid, meaning a new order of the ages. This is the Republic's ultimate declaration that the United States marks a new era in world history, a break from the old monarchical systems, a structure founded on rational and perpetual principles. The all-seeing eye, therefore, became the American symbol of providential destiny. It was a bold statement that the nation's success was not mere luck, but the fulfillment of a higher, rational purpose.
From parchment to pocket, the dollar bill. Despite its central importance, the Great Seal remained largely unseen by the public, reserved only for official documents of state. The symbols remained arcane, the language hidden on paper, not in stone. That changed dramatically in the 20th century. In 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry A. Wallace, oversaw the redesign of the $1 bill. Wallace, deeply interested in esoteric symbolism and classical history, was captivated by the philosophical depth of the reverse side of the Great Seal. He urged Roosevelt to place the entire design, including the pyramid and the all-seeing eye, onto the currency. This act catapulted the most esoteric of American symbols from a dusty archive onto the most recognizable piece of paper in the world.
The symbolism, intended by the founders to communicate high-minded ideals to the initiated, was suddenly made public and immediately subject to misinterpretation. The placement of the symbol on the dollar bill ignited decades of intense debate and conspiracy theories. For those unfamiliar with its Egyptian and Enlightenment origins, the eye quickly became associated with secret societies. Many viewed it as definitive proof of a Masonic or Illuminati control over the financial and political destiny of the United States. Surveillance. The all-seeing aspect was reinterpreted in the modern era as a sinister symbol of government surveillance and control, rather than divine or rational vigilance. Globalism. The Novus Ordo Seclorum, intended to mean a new order of the ages, was often mistranslated or misrepresented as the New World Order, lending a sinister globalist bent to the entire symbol. The architectural echoes in the federal city. Even outside the official currency, the spirit of the all-seeing eye, vigilance, provenance, and eternal watchfulness is carved into the literal architecture of Washington, D.C. Look at the Library of Congress. Its interior is a riot of allegory and symbolism. The recurring presence of large, watchful eyes in the decorative motifs, often incorporated into shields or surrounded by laurel wreaths, reinforces the eye's initial purpose, to guard the knowledge of the Republic. The eye asserts that the pursuit of truth and the preservation of history are sacred duties protected by a higher, ever-present principle. In the National Archives, the architecture is designed to communicate permanent, unassailable security. Though the explicit eye is often subtle, the very concept of the structure, a massive, impenetrable vault guarding the founding documents, is a physical manifestation of the promise made by the eye of providence, that the nation's core principles are eternally watched over and preserved. The architects used the eye, whether literally carved or conceptually implied, to remind the citizen and the policymaker that their actions were not happening in a void. There was always an observer, be it the GAOTU, the collective reason of the Enlightenment, or the watchful gaze of the historical record. The final mystery of the capstone. The ultimate message of the American eye of providence rests in the unfinished nature of the pyramid. The pyramid is a structure built layer by layer through immense effort. The eye is separate from it, floating above where the capstone should be. The symbolic tension created by this gap is the heart of the American philosophical endeavor. We, the people, build the imperfect, temporary political structure below, but the final piece, perfection, lasting stability, the fulfillment of destiny, can only be achieved if we are guided by the light of that unblinking, eternal truth above. The eye is the symbol of the unattainable ideal that the Republic must forever strive toward. The all-seeing eye is not merely a sign of a secret society, but a profoundly complex statement about governance and destiny. It is a symbol that forces a dialogue between the sacred and the secular, the ancient myth and the modern rationale. It asks whether the American experiment is a purely human invention or one guided by a force of providence, reason, or even fate. Next time you see the eye on a dollar bill, a building facade, or a historical document, remember its long journey from the banks of the Nile to the Capitol Dome. It is the silent, unblinking sentinel of the unseen city, waiting for you to decipher its true promise of eternal vigilance. We have explored the symbols, the geometry, and the classical forms. In our final chapter, we will bring this entire hidden language together and reveal the grand, unified message that the founders encoded into the very streets and structures of the American Republic. 6. The labyrinth and the grid, the esoteric meaning of city planning and street layouts. In the architecture of power, the city itself is the ultimate canvas. The way streets are laid out, the alignment of major avenues, and the geometric relationships between buildings are not arbitrary choices. They are a spatial language designed to reinforce order, convey destiny, and, some argue, embed arcane philosophy into the very ground upon which citizens walk. This section moves beyond the statue and the carving to explore the unseen city, the geometry of control, faith, and influence woven into the street layouts of Washington, D.C. This is the labyrinth and the grid, where rational efficiency meets esoteric design. The clash of ideals, grid versus grand plan. In 1791, when the young United States began planning its permanent seat of government, two competing philosophies of city planning were vying for dominance. The first was the utilitarian grid, championed by figures like William Penn for Philadelphia. This plan was purely rational, democratic, and commercially minded. Streets run straight and perpendicular, creating easily divisible, egalitarian lots. Its message is efficiency, accessibility, and equal commerce. The second was the grand, monumental plan rooted in the Baroque capitals of Europe and the classical planning of Rome. This approach uses diagonals, circles, and monumental axes to focus power, inspire awe, and structure public life around centers of authority. Its message is sovereignty, hierarchy, and imperial vision. The United States chose the latter. When President George Washington appointed Major Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French military engineer, to design the new capital city, he didn't just hire a surveyor. He hired a man steeped in the principles of Versailles and Roman imperial design. L'Enfant's task was not simply to create a functional city, but to create a political diagram. Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, the architect of destiny. L'Enfant arrived with a vision that was vast, ambitious, and fundamentally non-egalitarian. He saw the city as a symbolic map of the Republic's potential. He declared that his design must command the admiration of the present and future times. L'Enfant was a member of a generation that blended Enlightenment rationalism with a deep appreciation for classical forms, often filtered through the lens of fraternal societies like Freemasonry. His plan, officially submitted in 1791, was a dual-system masterpiece, a simple grid overlaid and interrupted by massive diagonal avenues radiating from key symbolic points. The grid, running north-south and east-west, was the body of the city, practical, uniform, and suitable for commercial development. The diagonals were the city's soul, grand, processional, and symbolic, linking the loci of power and channeling energy into the political heart of the Republic. The rational geometry, military, and stability. On the surface, the L'Enfant plan was deeply practical, reflecting L'Enfant's military experience. 1. Defense and order, the grid. The north-south and east-west grid provided a logical framework for rapid deployment of troops, containment of civil unrest, and quick navigation. It was a military plan for a capital that had just experienced a revolution. 2. Land value, the square blocks. The predictable rectangular blocks allowed for systematic land speculation and development, ensuring the city's financial viability. 3. The monumental axis. The central alignment of the National Mall linking the legislative branch, Capitol Hill, to the executive branch, the President's House, was a clear, rational statement about the separation and balance of powers. This east-west axis, the axis historic, is the spinal cord of the city. But this practical geometry was just the mask for the hidden esoteric geometry beneath. The esoteric geometry, the diagonals and focal points. The true symbolic power of the DC layout lies in the intersections of the diagonal avenues and the resulting geometric shapes they impose upon the grid. These diagonals, named after the states, were designed to focus attention on the circles and squares where powerful federal buildings would reside, granting them an almost spiritual magnetic pull. Longfont meticulously chose the two primary seats of power, the Capitol and the President's House, White House, and constructed a system of interlocking symbols around them, ensuring they were both the physical and metaphysical centers of the new republic. 1. The Capitol and the Sunburst. From the Capitol, the seat of the people's representatives, avenues radiate outwards like the rays of the sun. This sunburst geometry is an ancient symbol of universal sovereignty and divine illumination, akin to the rays surrounding the all seeing eye. It suggests that the political light of the nation issues forth from the legislative center, illuminating the land. The Capitol sits on top Jenkins Hill, the highest point in the immediate vicinity, making it the geometric and topographic apex of the entire plan. Its elevation suggests that the collective wisdom of Congress is the highest authority under Providence. 2. The White House and the hidden pentagram. The area surrounding the White House is where the geometric language becomes most intriguing and where conspiracy theories take firm root. Five key avenues form a distinct, large shape focused on the executive mansion. Pennsylvania Avenue, linking the White House to the Capitol, the path of ceremonial power. Vermont Avenue, K Street, the horizontal bar. Massachusetts Avenue, the main diagonal of the pentagram. And New York Avenue. When traced and connected, these avenues form a nearly perfect pentagram or five-pointed star. The pentagram is one of the most versatile and controversial symbols in esoteric history. In Pythagorean tradition, it represents perfection, health, and the harmonious union of the body and the spirit, the four elements united by the spirit. In medieval magic and later occultism, it was associated with various forces, from protection to invocation.
Skeptics argue this shape is merely a coincidental byproduct of L'Enfant's attempt to maximize connections to the White House. However, proponents of the esoteric view point to the precise placement of key buildings and squares along these lines. The southern point, the point of the star that seems to point directly toward the White House, the northwest axis, the alignment of Massachusetts Avenue and its mirror on the grid, often cited as a symbolic channeling of energy. Whether intentional or accidental, the resulting geometry, a pentagram superimposed upon the seat of the nation's executive power, has cemented the belief that the city was designed as a colossal Masonic or occult temple. 3. The Grand Triangle, the judiciary axis. Another powerful geometric figure created by the diagonals is the triangle formed by the Capitol, the White House, and the Judiciary Square, the area where the Supreme Court and federal courthouse are situated. This triangle visually encapsulates the three branches of government, the ultimate symbol of the Enlightenment ideal of checks and balances. This triangle is often referred to as the triangle of authority. By locating the three centers of constitutional power at the vertices of a strong geometric figure, L'Enfant was spatially asserting the indivisibility and stability of the new political framework. It echoes the sacred triangle of the Eye of Providence, substituting the three parts of the Trinity with the three branches of the Republic. The Masonic overlay, symbolism in the streets. The debate over the DC plan often circles back to the Masonic influences on the key founders, particularly George Washington, who was a master Mason, and the pervasive presence of Masonic lodges in the late 18th century. If L'Enfant's plan was meant to be a Masonic tracing board, a symbolic blueprint for a just society, what specific elements confirm this? The square encompasses. The overall design combines the rational right angles of the grid, the square, representing morality and earthly order,
with the arcs and diagonals, the compasses representing divine creation and celestial knowledge. The entire city plan, therefore, becomes a living representation of the fundamental Masonic emblem. Alignment and ritual. Many avenues are alleged to align with specific celestial events or important dates in the Masonic calendar. For instance, the original axes align with key solar transits, linking the city's structure to the heavens, an ancient practice used by architects of temples and megaliths. The zero point, the intersection of two axes, often Pennsylvania Avenue and the National Mall axis, establishes a geodetic center for the city. In esoteric traditions, the center point is often the nexus of spiritual and earthly power, the fixed point from which all else is measured and governed. The architectural rhetoric here is twofold. For the average citizen, the streets are simply avenues. For the initiated, the lines on the map, the angles, the intersections, the vast, deliberate open spaces are a constant, silent affirmation that the city's structure is aligned with higher, more permanent principles than mere political expediency. The power of the labyrinth, guiding human experience. Regardless of the intent behind the exact angles, the practical effect of L'Enfant's design is the creation of a political labyrinth designed to guide the human experience of power. 1. Channeled movement. The diagonals were designed to create rapid access between centers of power, but they also confuse the casual visitor. The grid's simplicity is constantly broken by the interruption of the avenues, creating complicated intersections, circles that force drivers and pedestrians to navigate around monuments rather than directly through them. This confusion, proponents argue, subliminally reinforces the city's complexity and resistance to simple understanding. 2. The vista and the monument. The radial structure ensures that monumental buildings are almost constantly visible from the avenues leading toward them. This use of the vista, a long controlled line of sight, is a crucial element of Baroque and imperial design. You don't simply find the capital, you're driven toward it. The city layout transforms the process of travel into a political procession, constantly funneling the eye and the body toward the sites of national authority. This spatial rhetoric conditions the mind to recognize, respect, and feel the weights of centralized power. The unseen barrier. The vast open spaces like the National Mall and the numerous traffic circles act as a buffer between the everyday life of the residential grid and the machinery of government. These spaces are intentionally difficult to navigate, creating a psychological barrier that reminds the populace that the workings of the state are separate, protected, and monumental. The labyrinth and the grid, therefore, is the ultimate expression of the unseen city. It is a dualistic plan, the rational, ordered grid for the common man and commerce, overlaid by the symbolic, monumental axes for the state and destiny. Whether L'Enfant was a conscious agent of arcane philosophy or simply a brilliant military engineer utilizing the most potent architectural devices of his era is ultimately irrelevant. What matters is the effect. The city's plan succeeds because it uses geometry to speak a language older than the Republic itself. It asserts that the American state is not a temporary fluke, but an ordered, divinely sanctioned structure perpetually overseen and guided by eternal principles. It is a city designed to feel eternal, powerful, and mysterious. A city that uses geometry to write its own destiny in stone and asphalt. We have now systematically deconstructed the core vocabulary of the unseen city. The classical foundation, the symbolic ouroboros, the watchful eye, and the coded geometry of the streets. In our final chapter, We will synthesize these elements to understand the ultimate unified message that Washington, D.C. attempts to send, resolving the tensions between the hidden, esoteric symbols and the public, rational democracy they are meant to sustain.
07. The secret geometry of the Gothic revival. When faith and algebra collided in brick and mortar. This was the Gothic revival, an architectural movement that swept across the United States, transforming its religious and academic landscape. It wasn't just a nostalgic trend, it was a profound philosophical statement, a commitment to an ancient belief that mathematics was the language of God and that perfect spiritual truth could be achieved by adhering to specific, divinely sanctioned geometric rules. This section is a deep dive into the 19th century return to Gothic style in churches and universities, focusing on the highly complex geometric rules, from the golden ratio to the sacred square, that were believed to convey divine perfection in brick and mortar. The reaction to rationalism, the return to feeling. The Gothic revival was, in many ways, a cultural reaction against the stern, ordered classicism of the American founding generation. The early republic favored neoclassicism, temples of reason with columns, porticos, and severe symmetry. This style spoke of republican virtue, human capability, and clarity. But by the 1830s, this emphasis on pure reason began to feel cold and spiritually empty to many. The rise of Romanticism, the focus on emotion, and the burgeoning religious movements of the Second Great Awakening demanded a different architectural language. Gothic architecture, with its soaring vaults, dramatic shadows, and intricate detail, spoke not of logic, but of sublimity and transcendence. It was designed to humble the human spirit and elevate the eye toward heaven. For the new generation of American builders, replicating the Gothic style was seen as a way to recapture a perceived religious purity lost during the Enlightenment's rational secularism. The architects and theologians leading this charge believed that the original medieval builders possessed a secret knowledge, a sacred algebra that connected earthly structures to celestial harmony. The sacred geometry of the medieval masters. At the heart of the Gothic style lay the principle of sacred geometry, the belief that certain shapes, ratios, and numerical relationships, like 3, 7, 12, were divinely ordained and held metaphysical power. The 19th century revivalists meticulously studied the ruins of European cathedrals, determined to rediscover this lost language. The geometry was often generated not by modern measuring tape, but by rope, compass, and square, relying on the simplest possible tools to produce the most complex results. 1. The Pythagorean Trinity and the perfect square. The primary building block of most Gothic planning was the vesica piscis, the intersection of two circles with the same radius, where the center of each lies on the circumference of the other. From the vesica piscis, the builders derived the essential shape for the nave and transepts, the root to rectangle, a rectangle where the diagonal is twice the length of the shorter side. This shape, defined by the geometry of the square, was believed to contain the secrets of perfection and stability. The square, representing the physical material world, the four directions, the four elements. The circle, representing the eternal, spiritual world, infinity, God. By building a cathedral out of the geometries derived from the circle and the square, the architects were literally constructing a meeting point between the eternal and the temporal, using geometry as the mediator. 2. The golden ratio, or phi. Perhaps the most revered ratio was the golden ratio, phi, approximately 1.618.
This ratio, found in natural patterns from pine cones to galaxies, was believed to be the ultimate signature of God's design. Gothic Revival architects meticulously calculated and deployed the golden ratio in the proportions of their American churches and university halls. For the facade, the ratio of the building's overall height to its width was often phi. Window placement, the division of the main facade into smaller sections, the placement of the rose window relative to the portals often followed phi proportions. Piers and arches, the relationship between the height of the column supporting an arch and the span of the arch itself was frequently adjusted to approximate the divine ratio. The purpose was to create a sense of visual harmony so perfect and balanced that it would trigger a subconscious recognition of divine order in the worshiper. The geometry was not merely decorative, it was a spiritual technology intended to elevate consciousness. The flowering of reason in stone, the rose window. The most visible and complex use of sacred geometry in the Gothic Revival is the rose window. These massive, circular windows, often dominating the transept or main entrance of a church, are a synthesis of light, color, and number. The rose window is a giant, frozen mandala derived from the compass and the circle, often incorporating 1. Radial symmetry. The spokes radiating from the center are often divisible by holy numbers, typically 6, 8, 10, or 12. The number 12, representing the apostles, the tribes of Israel, and cosmic completeness, 12 months, 12 hours, was particularly potent. 2. Trifoil and quatrefoil. The recurring use of the trifoil, a shape derived from 3 overlapping circles symbolizing the Trinity, and the quatrefoil, 4 circles symbolizing the Gospels or the 4 seasons, provided the basic structural units for the complex tracery. In churches across America, from St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to smaller parish churches, the rose window served as an architectural sermon. As the sun shone through the stained glass, the light was physically fractured and organized by divine geometry, reminding the congregation that even light and time were subjects of God's mathematical order. The experience was not intellectual, it was purely emotional and spiritual.
The sacred algebra of the American University. The Gothic Revival found its second great American home in the universities, institutions that grew exponentially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Example, Yale, Princeton, the University of Chicago. The decision to adopt the collegiate Gothic style was a deliberate rejection of the factory-like brick buildings of early American utilitarian education. The university adopted Gothic to achieve 2 main goals. 1. Establishing instant tradition. By mimicking the centuries-old campuses of Oxford and Cambridge, American universities instantly conferred upon themselves an aura of ancient wisdom and legitimacy, a form of architectural cultural inheritance. 2. Defining the purpose of study. The architecture itself declared that the pursuit of knowledge was not a purely technical or commercial endeavor, but a spiritual and ethical quest. The high ceilings, dark wood, and cloistered courtyards were designed to foster reverence, quiet contemplation, and a sense of shared, enduring mission. The architects embedded the geometry of the cathedral into the reading room and the lecture hall. The dimensions of the libraries often followed phi, and the repeating vertical lines of the buttresses and chimneys reinforced the sense of spiritual ascent found in the churches. The architecture was literally designed to influence the student's mind, using height and shadow to encourage humility in the face of immense knowledge, and to subtly remind them that true learning required spiritual, not just intellectual, illumination. The geometry served as the algebra of aspiration. The ritual space of the American church.
To understand the Gothic revival's geometric success, we must consider the ritual space it created. The geometry was kinetic, it directed movement and attention. The typical layout, which followed the medieval Latin cross, was designed to be a symbolic pilgrimage. The nave, the long central aisle, often proportioned according to the root 2 rectangle, represented the path of the soul through life. The geometry of the space was engineered to make the walk feel long, deep, and reflective. The altar, always placed at the highest, most geometrically complex point, was the destination. The apse behind it often utilized complex multi-sided geometries, the heptagon or dodecagon, symbolizing the celestial city of New Jerusalem. Verticality. The geometry of the soaring arch and the clustered column was designed to pull the eye relentlessly upward. The point of the Gothic arch is not merely structural, it is transcendent. Unlike the Roman arch, which sits heavily on the earth, the Gothic arch points directly to the heavens, an architectural prayer in stone. This deliberate use of geometry to shape the experience of faith reflects the belief that the geometry itself held the secret to creating holy ground. By building a church according to these strict ancient rules, the builders ensured that the structure was not just a container for worship, but a symbolic map of the cosmos. The modern legacy, the unseen influence. While the peak of the Gothic revival faded by the mid-20th century, its geometric and spiritual legacy remains profound in the American cultural landscape. The style, with its reliance on mathematical precision to convey divine truth, stands as a powerful testament to the idea that architecture is never neutral. It is always a philosophical argument built in 3 dimensions. The persistence of awe. The Gothic revival proved that in a modern, industrializing, and increasingly secularizing world, Americans still yearn for an architectural language that could convey mystery and transcendence. The geometric complexity was a deliberate antidote to the mechanical simplicity of the industrial age. The geometry of memory. Today, many of America's most revered academic and spiritual spaces, churches, cathedrals, and university quads, retain this geometry of awe. They are the architectural memory banks of a time when faith and rigorous mathematical science were considered 2 sides of the same sacred coin. The complex, perfect geometry ensures that these buildings are not merely shelter, but enduring vessels for spiritual contemplation. From the perfect circle derived by the compass to the soaring, phi-proportioned spire, the Gothic revival architects achieved a powerful goal. They demonstrated that algebra was not just a tool for finance or engineering, but a channel for communion with the divine. They left us a body of architecture that remains visually breathtaking because its beauty is rooted in the eternal, perfect language of mathematics. We have explored the symbols of the state, the geometry of the capital, and the sacred algebra of the revivalists. We have traveled from the Egyptian monolith to the American cathedral. In our final chapter, we will bring these threads together and reveal the total, unified message that the American architects of the unseen city were truly trying to convey.
'08. The era of the hidden mark. The silent protest of workers and immigrants carved into the facade. But now we shift our gaze. We look down and we look inward. We examine the stones themselves, the seams, the hidden corners, the parts of the architecture that the public was never meant to see, and the architects never intended to be symbolic. Here, in the mortar, the brick, and the hidden carvings, lies the true unseen city. The history written not by presidents and theologians, but by the hands of the forgotten majority, the working class immigrants, the laborers, the stonecutters, and the carpenters. Their marks are not declarations of grand philosophies, but silent protests, prayers for protection, and simple, defiant claims of identity. This is the history from the bottom up. The unseen army. Context of labor. The grand architectural booms of the 18th and 19th centuries, which gave us everything from the Capitol Dome to the Gothic Revival universities, were fueled by massive waves of immigration and a labor force often working under brutal conditions. In the foundational years, the construction sites of cities like New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. were polyglot communities of marginalized workers, freed slaves, Irish quarrymen, German stone carvers, Italian artisans, and Scandinavian timber framers. They worked with immense skill, but often endured poverty, short lifespans, and a profound lack of historical credit. These men, and occasionally women, were the muscle and the craft behind the nation's monuments. While the architect received the glory for the design, the workers were responsible for the execution. And it is in that execution that they found a tiny, subversive space to leave their mark. When they carved a piece of stone, they didn't just shape the granite. They infused it with a piece of their identity, their faith, and their defiance. This is the history from the bottom up. Mason's marks, the signature of skill. The most formalized yet hidden marks in this silent history are the Mason's marks. These are small geometric symbols, sometimes just a few inches high, incised into the face of a stone block, often on the concealed side or high up where they would be invisible from the ground. In the medieval and early modern building trades, these marks served a highly practical, non-esoteric function: accountability and payroll. 1. Quality control. Every stonecutter had a unique mark. Before steam-powered milling, stones were rough cut in the quarry and then dressed, finished, by hand by the masons. By marking their work, the master builder could track which mason was responsible for each piece. If a stone was faulty, the mason who marked it was held responsible. 2. Payment. The marks were the ticket to payment. Masons were often paid by the piece, a certain rate for a finely dressed cornice stone, another rate for a simple wall block. At the end of the week, the marks were counted and wages were dispensed. As the building trade industrialized, the need for these physical marks faded, but the tradition persisted. In 19th century American construction, leaving a mark became a ritualistic act of craft pride. When an immigrant stonecutter etched his inherited symbol, perhaps a star, a compass, or a geometric form related to his lodge or his guild, he was not signaling an occult organization, but simply stating, "I, the craftsman, finished this piece of eternity." The mark, therefore, is a silent boast, a claim of ownership over a fractional piece of a monumental structure built for the ruling class. It is the worker refusing to be anonymous. Apotropic marks, the plea for protection. Beyond the professional claim of the Mason's mark, many other marks found in American structures were intensely personal and spiritual. These are the apotropic marks, symbols carved not for pay, but for protection against the unseen dangers of the world. During the era of the Gothic Revival, when structures were often massive, dark, and filled with deep shadows, the belief in ill luck, fire spirits, and witchcraft was surprisingly persistent, especially among immigrant communities steeped in European folk traditions. These marks are almost always found near vulnerable parts of the building, around fireplaces where fire spirits might enter, near doorways, a boundary between safe and dangerous space, or under eaves and windows. They include hex foils, or witches' marks. These are six-petaled flower patterns often drawn with a single continuous line. They were believed to confuse and trap evil spirits, forcing them to follow the line indefinitely until dawn when their power was lost. They are common in the oldest American barns and sometimes appear hidden in the stone joints of federal buildings.
The SS mark, simple, repetitive carvings of the letter S, or sometimes M. This symbol is often interpreted as a plea to the Virgin Mary, or Sancta Maria, or Saint Simon, asking for divine intercession against fire, disease, or disaster. A common anxiety for poor workers living and working in unstable, crowded urban centers. Pentagrams. Unlike the powerful geometric pentagram of the DC street plan, the worker's pentagram was often crude, scratched with a knife, and used as a simple protective five-pointed star to ward off bad luck, particularly in timber frame structures vulnerable to fire. These hidden marks represent a vernacular history of anxiety and faith. They reveal that while the official symbolism of the cathedral spoke of eternal grace, the men building it were worried about their families, their wages, and whether the timber frame would burn down before the last payment was made. They represent the quiet persistence of folk religion in the shadow of grand, organized faith. Benchmarks and datums. The authority of the surveyor. Another class of hidden mark that defines the built environment is utterly devoid of any esoteric intent, yet becomes a monumental record of history. The benchmark. A benchmark is a fixed point of known elevation, typically a small copper disc or a chiseled arrow placed in a durable object or structure, like the corner of a foundation or a bridge abutment. Surveyors use these marks to establish a datum, a base reference point for all subsequent measurements. The broad arrow or crow's foot is a common form of survey mark used by government agencies. It signifies the point of reference for all maps and heights in the area. While purely utilitarian, these marks carry a certain accidental symbolism. They are the fixed truths of the physical world, the undeniable evidence of the Earth's measured geometry, hidden in plain sight. For example, on the steps of the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., you can find a series of marks. Some are official geodetic benchmarks, and some are simple lines etched by the stonecutters. The practical mark and the personal mark are often separated by mere inches, symbolizing the two competing histories written into the structure, the official record of the state and the ephemeral memory of the individuals. The grotesques and the gargoyles, humor and subversion. In the Gothic revival, particularly on academic and religious buildings, the hidden mark often takes on a mischievous, satirical, or humorous quality in the form of grotesques and gargoyles. A gargoyle's original purpose was functional, a spout designed to carry water away from the wall. A grotesque is similar but purely decorative, having no water spouting function. While the main facade of a Gothic Revival university hall might feature noble figures of philosophers or saints, a quick search of the upper stories and corners often reveals a hidden world of playful subversion. These were the spaces where the skilled, often underappreciated carvers were giving artistic license to vent their frustrations or memorialize a private joke. Examples found on American campuses include the disgruntled dean, a small carving depicting a figure with exaggerated spectacles and an unhappy expression, often positioned to look permanently disappointed. The modern utility, hidden near a chimney or a ventilation shaft, a grotesque carved holding a telephone or wearing a baseball cap, a satirical insertion of modern life into the medieval facade. The profane in the sacred. In one famous example at a major university, a gargoyle was placed so that it appears to moon the administrative building across the quad, a quiet act of defiance by the stone carver against the authority that commissioned him. These carvings represent the silent protest of the artisan, a way to use highly complex craft skills to mock, humanize, or satirize the very institutions that hired them. They are the working man's way of saying, you paid for the stone, but I own the joke. It is a vital, subversive tradition that ensured even the most solemn American structures retains a hidden core of irreverent humanity. The identity marks of the immigrant workforce. The construction of major American infrastructure and landmark buildings in the 19th century was often a massive collaboration of distinct ethnic groups, each bringing their own architectural superstitions and vernacular symbols. These hidden identity marks were a way for workers to feel spiritually connected to their heritage in a new, often hostile land. German hex signs, while most common in Pennsylvania barns, elements of German folk art like stars, birds, and geometric floral patterns, often painted but sometimes etched, would occasionally find their way into the foundation or woodwork of churches and homes built by German immigrant carpenters, offering protection and identity. Celtic knotwork, Irish and Scottish stonecutters, whose craft heritage involved intricate Celtic knotwork, sometimes incorporated a simplified, small knot into a decorative border or a pillar base, ensuring that a piece of their distant homeland was physically embedded in the American soil. Scandinavian runes, in the Midwestern states, particularly around the Great Lakes where Scandinavian settlement was heavy, small, crudely carved runes, often protection or prosperity symbols, have been found on structural timbers of early public buildings, a subtle prayer for the durability of the structure and the community. These are not the calculated symbols of the founding fathers. They are the architectural echoes of homes left behind. They represent a profound human need to mark territory, to claim a piece of the new, massive edifice for one's own tribe, faith, and ancestry. The forgotten signatures, dates, and initials. The simplest, most pervasive, and most moving marks are the raw initials and dates left by the workers themselves. These are often found behind plaster, scrawled on a brick wall before it was covered, in attics and basements, written on structural beams or foundation stones in the darkest corners. On the back of carvings, the artisan would sign the hidden side of the stone they had finished. These marks are the laborer's direct personal assertion into the historical record. They are simple messages written to the void, to the future, or to the next worker who might tear down the wall in 200 years. J. O'Malley, 1878. Tired. We built this for nothing. J and R. Maria was here, 1902. These are the unplanned archives of the working class. They provide a human scale to structures that were designed to feel superhuman and eternal. When historians and restorers uncover these initials, they are briefly placed into intimate conversation with the ghost of the past, a person who simply wanted their brief existence, their sweat, and their contribution to be acknowledged by the stone they shaped. The architecture of the unseen city, therefore, is not a unified message controlled from the top down. It is a dialogue, a constant tension between the symbols of power and the silent subversive marks of the people who built them. We have now traveled the complete arc of the unseen city. We have examined the classical roots, the secretive symbols of the founding, the sacred mathematics of the revivalists, and the humanizing marks of the laborers. In our final summation, we will bring these four layers together to reveal the total, unified, and often contradictory message that the architecture of the United States attempts to send, and what this enduring language of stone, geometry, and hidden intention means for the Republic today.
9. The Gargoyle's Watch, a warning in stone and the fear of the unseen world. These are the gargoyles and grotesques, the stone guardians who keep the highest, darkest watch over our most sacred and academic spaces. They are beasts, demons, hybrid monsters, and satirical humans, poised between heaven and earth. Their presence is a powerful reminder that the grand designs of men are always vulnerable to the unseen, chaotic forces of the world. This section is a deep dive into these decorative but profoundly symbolic elements, discussing their dual role as essential structural tools and as frightening protectors meant to ward off evil spirits, the architecture of fear built right into the American facade. 1. The dual duty, water and warning. To understand the gargoyle, we must first understand its literal structural duty. The word gargoyle comes from the Old French gargoule, meaning throat or gullet, and is related to the verb gargouiller, to gurgle. A true gargoyle has only one job: to divert rainwater. In medieval and Gothic revival architecture, massive roofs shed immense volumes of water. If this water were allowed to run down the face of the stone walls, the erosive power would quickly degrade the mortar and destabilize the structure. The gargoyle is essentially an elaborate waterspout. The rainwater runs from the gutter through the statue's body and out of its mouth, projecting the stream far away from the valuable masonry. This practical function imbues the gargoyle with its first layer of symbolism, protection through deflection. It sacrifices its appearance and embraces its frightening form to physically protect the integrity of the sacred space, pushing back the literal floodwaters of chaos. 2. The grotesque, the pure symbol. The gargoyle's purely decorative cousin is the grotesque. The distinction is simple. A grotesque looks exactly like a gargoyle, but it does not function as a waterspout. It is placed purely for symbolic, moral, or satirical effect. The Gothic revival architects loved the grotesque because it allowed them to insert complex, non-classical symbolism into the otherwise ordered structure. While the church sermon addressed the conscious mind, the grotesque was meant to address the subconscious, the superstitious, and the vulnerable soul. The spiritual function of both figures is called apotropic, meaning intended to ward off evil. The fundamental belief, inherited from ancient and medieval folk traditions, was that evil spirits, demons, and the forces of darkness could be scared away or distracted by something uglier than themselves. The gargoyle, in its fearful state of frozen malevolence, acts as a sentinel of chaos, a visual force meant to repel any demonic influence attempting to enter the sacred ground below. 3. The fear of the unseen in 19th century America. Why did a young nation, supposedly dedicated to Enlightenment reason and modern progress, embrace this deeply superstitious medieval practice in the 19th century? The answer lies in the deep undercurrent of anxiety and rapid change that defined the American experience. 1. Epidemics and urban crowding. The 19th century was marked by devastating, often unmisunderstood epidemics, cholera, typhus, and yellow fever, that swept through crowded cities. These diseases were perceived not merely as biological, but as curses or divine punishments. Building a church or hospital guarded by fierce stone beasts was a very real, tangible plea for spiritual protection against invisible malice. 2. The tension between science and faith. The rise of Darwinism and empirical science put immense pressure on traditional religion. The Gothic revival was a conservative pushback, an attempt to restore the sense of mystery and spiritual authority that rationalism was eroding. The grotesque, embodying the irrational and the supernatural, reasserted the existence of the unseen world and the spiritual necessity of the church. 3. Immigrant folk beliefs. The massive waves of European immigrants, Irish, Italian, German, Slavic,
brought with them rich, living traditions of folk Catholicism and regional superstitions concerning the Malikyo, or evil eye, house spirits, and malevolent fairies. The masons and carvers who built these structures naturally incorporated symbols they believed held genuine protective power. The American Gothic facade became a psychological battlefield, a place where the rational geometry of the Enlightenment met the ancient, superstitious fears of the working class soul. 4. The taxonomy of the American grotesque. The figures carved onto American buildings are not arbitrary. They fall into distinct symbolic categories, each carrying a specific moral or intellectual message to the students and congregants below. 1. The beasts of moral warning, the sins. These figures often represented the classic moral failings or the dangers that corrupted the soul. The dragon or serpent, a universal symbol of primordial chaos, temptation, and the devil. Placing the dragon grotesque high on a library or chapel wall was a reminder that even the pursuit of knowledge could lead to intellectual pride or moral ruin. The ape, often carved in a human-like posture, represented avarice or greed, the base animalistic urges that distracted from divine contemplation. The lion or bear, when carved aggressively, they symbolize wrath or untamed savagery. When carved guarding a book, they symbolize courage, protecting wisdom. Their interpretation depended heavily on context and position. 2. The guardians of academic virtue, the allies. Particularly prominent on university campuses like Princeton and Yale, these figures celebrated the virtues necessary for serious study. The owl is the most common academic grotesque, symbolizing wisdom, learning, and vigilance. The owl is placed to watch over the students studying below, a silent patron of late-night reading. The griffin or phoenix, mythological hybrids often representing eternal life, the phoenix, or vigilance and strength, the griffin. They signaled that the knowledge pursued within the walls was timeless and enduring. The scribe or scholar, not always a monster, but a human figure intently reading or writing. These serve as moral models, reminding students of the dedication required for intellectual pursuit. 3. The satirist and the joker, the subversive. As noted in the previous section, the most fascinating figures are the ones that subvert the architecture's solemnity. These were the stone carver's revenge, his personal commentary on the institution that hired him. The modern figure, figures holding objects that would have been anachronistic or ridiculous to a medieval eye, a telephone, a camera, or a modern pipe. This was the carver's way of inserting a critique of modernization or the commercialization of education or religion into the eternally medieval facade. The disappointed administrator. Caricatures of professors, librarians, or deans, often looking bored, angry, or confused. These were inside jokes carved in stone, a fleeting moment of working-class irreverence permanently embedded in the high-status masonry.
The occult geometry of ugliness. The effectiveness of the gargoyle is rooted in a specific principle of occult tradition: simultaneous repulsion and absorption. 1. Repulsion. The terrifying face is designed to instantly shock and repel evil spirits. It is a visual noise that disrupts the calm, ordered path that a demon might take to enter the building. The ugliness is a visual shield. 2. Absorption. In some traditions, the grotesque, especially if it is depicted consuming or vomiting, was believed to absorb the negative spiritual energy directed at the building. It acts as a spiritual scapegoat, drawing ill will into its frozen form, preventing the curse or evil influence from touching the sacred ground. The grotesque thus serves as a powerful psychological boundary. It is placed at the edge, on the roof line, the cornice, the water table, the transition point between the ordered cosmos within the church and the chaotic, dangerous world outside. Its function is to intercept all negative energy before it crosses the threshold.
Case study: the National Cathedral and the pop culture gargoyle. The Washington National Cathedral in D.C. offers a modern yet profound extension of the gargoyle tradition. While its design is deeply rooted in medieval geometry, its construction lasted well into the late 19th century, allowing for a unique blending of ancient protective symbols and contemporary American satire. The cathedral features traditional carvings, but its gargoyle program also includes figures that are uniquely American. The Darth Vader grotesque, arguably the most famous example, a carving of the Star Wars villain Darth Vader, is hidden high on the Northwest Tower. This was the result of a design contest for children in the 1980s. The Taxman, figures representing modern bureaucracy and financial anxiety, the demons of contemporary American life, are also discreetly included. This phenomenon proves that the tradition is not merely historical mimicry, it is a living practice. The architects and carvers recognize that the function of the grotesque remains the same: to embody the fears and anxieties of the age, be it a medieval demon or a modern cultural icon, and to use that fearful image to stand eternal guard. The fear changes, but the stone sentinel remains. The gargoyle's enduring warning. The gargoyle and the grotesque are the architecture of pragmatic superstition. They reveal that beneath the Enlightenment veneer of the American Republic, there has always been a deep, enduring human fear of the things we cannot see, measure, or control. They stand as silent, petrified warnings to anyone who enters the sacred or scholarly space. To the faithful, beware of the chaos and temptation that wait just beyond the church door. To the scholar, remember that true wisdom requires facing down the grotesque truths of the world, not just the ordered figures of algebra. To the passerby, acknowledge the presence of the hidden, the irrational, and the terrifying in the world, for they are real enough to be carved in stone. They are the keepers of the gate, the grotesque mouthpieces of the unseen city, reminding us that every structure built on human ambition must still wrestle with the eternal forces of chaos. The geometry is the promise of order. The gargoyle is the recognition of its fragility. We have explored the classical rules, the secret lodges, the sacred algebra, and the folk magic embedded in the American landscape. We have traveled from the deliberate top down messages of the Capitol to the hidden, bottom up anxieties carved into the churches. Now it is time to synthesize these elements: the symbols of statecraft, the geometry of God, and the fears of the common man, to reveal the total, unified, and often contradictory message that the architecture of the United States attempts to send, and what this enduring language of stone means for the Republic today.
10. Art Deco's speed and strength. How the machine age replaced ancient gods with industrial motifs. Then came the Roaring Twenties. America suddenly and irrevocably declared its independence not just from the politics of the Old World, but from its history itself. The Great War had been fought and won with steel, engines, and mass production. The economy soared to dizzying heights, lifting corporations and the skyscrapers they occupied higher than ever before. The nation found a new deity, and its name was progress. This spiritual and material revolution demanded a completely new architectural language, Art Deco. It was a style born in France, but perfected in the United States, replacing the contemplative serenity of the past with the exhilarating, dizzying energy of the present. The Art Deco movement, arriving precisely when America's confidence was peaking, was an audacious declaration. We no longer need the myths of Olympus or the saints of the nave. Our new gods are the engineer, the financier, and the machine. We will worship at the altar of speed, power, and the vertical line. This transition section covers the 20th century's seismic shift. It examines the sleek, streamlined Art Deco style and how its symbols, lightning bolts, gears, sunbursts,
reflected America's new, singular obsession with technology, corporate speed, and centralized power, completely abandoning older spiritual and moralistic motifs. The Great Break. Form follows power. The Art Deco style, which dominated the American skyline from roughly 1925 through 1940, represented a total repudiation of the preceding architectural philosophies. The critique of the past. Against Beaux Arts, the style was seen as cumbersome, covered in irrelevant Roman garlands, fussy columns, and historically inaccurate figures. It was the architecture of the professor, not the innovator. Against Gothic revival, the religious, moralistic, and often intentionally crude symbols of the gargoyle and the saints were deemed superstitious and backward. The New World had no time for the fear of the unseen. It only feared inefficiency. Art Deco stripped away all this historical baggage. It was a style defined by synthesis, merging the geometric rigor of Cubism, the bright colors of Fauvism, and the efficiency of industrial design. Its core philosophical motto became, if it is modern and it moves, it is beautiful. Buildings became less like historical monuments and more like massive stationary engines. The architecture was designed to convey the thrill of a newly invented world where speed and precision were the highest virtues. This was the moment when the physical structure of a building became an advertisement for the corporate power housed within. The new pantheon, industrial motifs as divine symbols. The most significant symbolic change in Art Deco was the composition of its ornamental vocabulary. The old architectural language was of flora and fauna, acanthus leaves, eagles, angels. The new language was of mechanics and physics. Number 1, the gear and the cog, the worship of industry. If the Corinthian columns symbolized order, the gear symbolized function. The ubiquitous motif of the cog, the ratchet and interlocking wheels, became the ultimate symbol of the industrial age. In the Art Deco worldview, the human being was no longer defined by his relationship to God or nature, but by his role in the machine. The gear represented efficiency, collaboration, and the smooth, relentless turning of the modern economic engine. It was applied everywhere: elevator doors, ventilation grills, the capitals of columns, and the friezes of banks. This wasn't just decoration, it was a profound shift in symbolic focus. The gear symbolized the American value system of the era: productivity, collective motion, and the belief that any problem could be solved by engineering. Number 2, the lightning bolt, harnessing unseen power. The lightning bolt, or the jagged zigzag pattern, was the most explicit and potent new Art Deco symbol. It represented the triumph of science and technology over natural chaos. The advent of massive centralized electrical power, power grids, radio waves, telephone lines, was perhaps the defining technological miracle of the 1920s. Man had effectively stolen fire from the gods. The lightning bolt motif celebrated this harnessed energy, the power that lit the cities, ran the factories, and broadcast the news. It was incorporated into metalwork, stone carving, and stained glass, suggesting raw, controlled energy flowing through the building itself. This motif was a visual assertion that the power of the natural world was now captive to human invention, a direct spiritual replacement for the medieval notion of divine power. Number 3, the sunburst and the ray, optimism and emergence. The sunburst, a semicircle or fan-like spread of sharp radiating lines, was the aesthetic cornerstone of the style. This symbol did not represent Apollo, the ancient Greek sun god. It represented the dawning of the new age, a purely secular optimism, and the bright, powerful future promised by technology. It was a sign of new, powerful corporations rising rapidly on the horizon, an aesthetic nod to the explosive, upward trajectory of the American economy. It was an expression of corporate confidence so complete it was built into the very roof lines of the city.
The geometry of motion, streamlining, and the velocity ethos. Art Deco was the first architectural style to be heavily influenced by aerodynamics and the concept of velocity. The development of the automobile, the passenger airplane, and the high speed train gave rise to a subsidiary style known as streamline moderne. The streamlined style did not just look fast, it physically felt fast. It achieved this through horizontal emphasis. Though skyscrapers remained vertical, many buildings and internal elements began to feature long horizontal lines, emphasizing flow and speed, like the lines of a speeding train. The curve. Gone were the sharp corners of classical architecture. Art Deco embraced the smooth, sweeping curve, suggesting minimized air resistance, a design philosophy meant to make the static building feel as if it were moving rapidly through the air. The ziggurat, the signature stepped setback profile of the Art Deco skyscraper, reminiscent of ancient Mesopotamian temples, ziggurats, served a dual purpose. It satisfied new zoning laws requiring buildings to step back from the street to let light in, and symbolically, it created a dramatic upward thrust like a rocket preparing for launch. This vertical surge became synonymous with economic ambition. The architecture was selling a feeling, the feeling of being ahead. To work in an Art Deco building was to be part of the mechanism pushing American society forward at an accelerating rate. Case Study 1. The Chrysler Building, the corporate temple. No single building better captures the transition from spiritual motive to corporate statement than the Chrysler Building in New York City in 1930. It is Art Deco distilled into a single aggressive 1,046-foot exclamation point. The symbolism here is not hidden. It is an open stainless steel boast. The eagle heads. Instead of traditional gargoyles guarding against demons, the Chrysler Building features huge stylized gargoyle eagles at the 61st floor. These eagles, taken from the hood ornaments of 1929 Chrysler automobiles, serve the same apotropic function as their medieval counterparts, to stand guard. But they guard the corporate brand and its success, not a sacred relic. They are a physical declaration that the corporation's logo is now as potent a symbol as any biblical figure. The spire as a crown. The stainless steel spire, added at the last minute in a brilliant competitive architectural maneuver, is the building's most famous feature. It is a series of shimmering concentric arches, the ultimate sunburst motif, meant to catch and reflect the light. This spire is a crowning achievement of industry, replacing the religious cross or the classical dome with pure, unadorned, polished metal. It doesn't point to heaven, it points to the future. The wheels and hubcaps. The decorative bands on the tower are literal, stylized representations of hubcaps and radiator caps. The building is not just decorated in the Art Deco style, it is decorated with the very products that generated the wealth to construct it. The whole structure is a piece of massive, personalized corporate iconography. The Chrysler Building, in its dizzying verticality and aggressive streamlining, became the new template for the American corporate headquarters, a monument to the successful conversion of raw materials and mechanical ingenuity into unimaginable capital. Case Study 2. Rockefeller Center. Communication and the collective. If the Chrysler Building was the altar of the automobile king, Rockefeller Center was the vast, integrated temple complex dedicated to modern communication, commerce, and mass media. The symbolic program here was about democratized power and the organization of the collective workforce. Prometheus Unbound.
The centerpiece of the complex is the bronze statue of Prometheus, bringing fire to mankind. This is a classical motif, yes, but it is recontextualized into a celebration of human intellect and defiance. Specifically, the fire of electricity, radio, and global communication, the very services housed in the surrounding buildings. The message is secular. Man is his own God, stealing the necessary tools to forge his destiny. The radio waves. The RCA building, now 30 Rockefeller Plaza, is crowned with a series of stepped futuristic motifs and features numerous sculptural reliefs dedicated to the power of radio waves, telecommunication, and the mastery of invisible frequencies. The building is designed to look like a massive stepped antenna, asserting its role as the nerve center of the global network. The human collective. Unlike the Chrysler Building's focus on one man's success, Rockefeller Center is defined by its murals and reliefs celebrating the dignity of human labor and industry. Figures are shown mining, constructing, and inventing. The center celebrated the organized chaos of the machine age, where millions of people worked in concert to achieve technological miracles. Rockefeller Center utilized Art Deco to create a civic space of corporate democracy, proving that the machine aesthetic could be both monumental and accessible. The legacy, from steel to sentiment. The Art Deco period was short lived, largely ending with the onset of World War II, which redirected all metal, labor, and ambition. Yet its symbolic revolution was complete and irreversible. Art Deco gave America an architecture of fearless modernity. It taught us that symbols are transitory. Spiritual and historical symbols can be discarded when they no longer serve the prevailing economic and technological ideology. The corporate identity is sacred. The logo, the product, and the corporate name became legitimate subjects for architectural veneration, replacing the coats of arms and crests of older hierarchies. The new sublime is mechanical. The new aesthetic of the beautiful was not found in nature or antiquity, but in the polished gleam of stainless steel, the perfection of the factory made line, and the vertical terror of the dizzying skyscraper. The Art Deco skyline of Manhattan and other major cities remains the ultimate physical manifestation of the American dream, a brutal vertical surge of unchecked ambition, driven by the relentless, organized power of the machine. The unbridled faith in technology and corporate power that Art Deco celebrated would soon face its own reckoning. The Great Depression exposed the fragility beneath the steel sheen, and the post war era brought forth an architectural style, international style modernism, that sought to strip away even the decorative vestiges of Art Deco. It's time to move from the decorative flash of the machine age to the cold, rational geometry of the global era.
11. The Bauhaus Revolution, the intentional erasure of symbols in the quest for pure function. The Great Silence, when ornament became a crime. The dazzling, desperate roar of the 1920s came to a shuddering halt in October 1929. The polished stainless steel of the Chrysler Building, meant to reflect the endless, shimmering confidence of American capital, suddenly looked like a hollow, expensive joke. The gods of speed, power, and corporate efficiency, which Art Deco had so enthusiastically installed, were proven to be frail, mortal things. As the global economy crumbled, a competing architectural philosophy, one born not in the glittering commercial centers of New York and Paris, but in the smoke choked factories and idealistic universities of Weimar era Germany, was ready to take center stage. This movement, known primarily through the influence of the Bauhaus School, didn't just reject Art Deco, it rejected all architectural history that preceded it. The premise of this revolution was radical. Ornament is a lie. The symbolic language of architecture, a hidden grammar that had instructed, warned, and inspired Western civilization for millennia, from the Greek frieze to the Gothic arch, from the Roman wreath to the Art Deco lightning bolt, was declared bankrupt, useless, and even immoral.
This chapter marks the definitive point where the hidden language of buildings, the narrative told through sculptural relief, cornices, and decorative motifs, began to be truly forgotten by the mainstream public. The new architecture would speak a language of pure geometry, communicating nothing but its own function and material truth. The philosophical firing squad, loose and the moral war on decoration. The war against ornament was not merely aesthetic, it was a deeply felt ethical and moral crusade first formalized by the Viennese architect and essayist Adolf Loos at the turn of the century. His 1908 manifesto, Ornament and Crime, became the philosophical scripture for the subsequent Bauhaus generation. Loos argued that decoration was wasteful, primitive, and corrupting. He saw the modern, educated man, the citizen of the industrialized world, as being inherently above the need for ornament, which he likened to tattoos, proof of a savage mind. The critique against decoration rested on three pillars. One, economic immorality. Ornament required the wasteful expenditure of materials and, more importantly, human labor. To force a skilled craftsman to spend weeks carving a useless acanthus leaf was seen as an economic crime, diverting resources and manpower from the mass production of essential, affordable housing. In a world reeling from war and economic instability, ornament was indefensible. Luxury. 2. Moral deception. Ornament was inherently dishonest. It covered up the basic structure of the building and the reality of its materials. It disguised a concrete beam as a marble column or a cheap veneer as expensive hardwood. Modernism demanded truth to materials. If it is glass, let it be glass. If it is steel, let it be steel. 3. Historical tyranny. Every piece of decoration, a column, a pilaster, a gargoyle, came loaded with historical meaning, anchoring the building to a past era and a set of values, monarchy, religion, feudalism, that the revolutionary spirit of the 20th century sought to destroy. To create the future, architects felt they had to erase the memory of the past from their forms. The young architects and designers who would form the core of the Bauhaus adopted this austere doctrine. Their goal was nothing less than the purification of the architectural form, removing every last symbolic whisper that might distract from the primary mission to house, shelter, and serve. The workshop of the future, Gropius and the Bauhaus ideal. In 1919, Walter Gropius founded the Stadthalle Bauhaus in Weimar, Germany. His vision was not merely to start an architecture school, but to create a total work of art that united art, craft, and industry. The word Bauhaus itself, literally building house, echoed the medieval craft guilds, but its mission was absolutely future facing. Gropius's inaugural manifesto declared that the ultimate aim of all creative activity is the building, but this building would be functional, affordable, and reproducible. The core training replaced traditional art school disciplines with workshops focused on materials, wood, metal, weaving, ceramics, and typography. Students were taught not to copy historical styles, but to understand the intrinsic properties of the new industrial age materials steel, glass, and reinforced concrete. The Bauhaus aesthetic was formalized around a set of dictates. Geometry is universal. The only permissible decoration was the inherent logic of simple, Platonic forms the square, the circle, and the triangle. These shapes were considered universal, neutral, and devoid of cultural baggage. The grid was the framework. The structure of the building, the regular, visible grid of the steel or concrete frame, became the aesthetic centerpiece. It communicated order, economy, and rational planning. Form follows function, the new dogma. Borrowed from the American pioneer Louis Sullivan, this phrase was taken literally. If a building was a school, its form must express only the function of teaching and learning, not the grandeur of a classical temple of knowledge. If a roof needed a drain pipe, the drain pipe was not to be hidden, but celebrated. The architecture itself became an exercise in omission. Everything that could be removed, the cornice, the pediment, the statue, the relief, was ruthlessly exiled, leaving behind only the essential load bearing structure and the skin. This marked the point where the architect stopped being a decorator of moral ideas and became a social engineer designing the minimum necessary structure for modern living.
The new symbolic language of the unadorned. In its quest to erase symbols, modernism unintentionally created a new, stark language, a set of forms that communicated the values of the new era: transparency, hygiene, and dematerialization. The glass curtain wall, transparency, and the collective. The most powerful new symbol of modernism was the glass curtain wall, which became the hallmark of the international style. Historically, walls were fortresses, separating the inner, private life from the outer, public world. The glass wall dissolved this barrier. It symbolized hygiene and light, a moral cleanliness, rejecting the dark, dusty corners of Victorian structures. Light and air were seen as prerequisites for a healthy, rational society. Transparency, a political and corporate transparency, suggesting that the work conducted inside was honest, visible, and part of a collective effort. Dematerialization. By maximizing the glass area, the building's mass seemed to disappear, leaving only the thin, visible frame of the structural skeleton. It celebrated the triumph of modern tensile strength, steel, over ancient compressive strength of stone. The symbol was no longer a carved allegory of justice. It was the uninterrupted surface of the window itself, reflecting the sky and the surrounding city, symbolizing the integration of the structure into its urban environment. The flat roof, freedom from tradition. The flat roof was a deliberately confrontational element. For millennia in Europe, the pitched roof symbolized shelter, home, and tradition, designed to shed rain and snow. The modernist flat roof was a functional and symbolic break, made possible by modern waterproof membranes and reinforced concrete. It accomplished two things: rejection of history. It physically refused the visual language of the past. And a fifth facade. It was treated as a functional space, a roof garden, a communal terrace, or a sun deck. This emphasized the social utility of every surface, turning wasted space into a new resource for the communal life of the building's occupants. The pilotis, lifting the building from the earth. Le Corbusier, another leading figure in the movement, formalized this idea with his 5 points of architecture, chief among them being the use of pilotis, slender pillars, to lift the building off the ground. Symbolically, the pilotis freed the structure from its dependence on the earth. The ground floor was now left open for circulation, parking, or public space. This represented a philosophical liberation. The modern life was rational, clean, and elevated, no longer mired in the historical muck of the street level. It suggested a technologically advanced building that was light, mobile, and intellectually detached from its surroundings. The Exodus and the international style. The Bauhaus's influence exploded precisely because it was forced to flee. With the rise of the Nazi regime, which condemned modernism as degenerate art, the school was pressured to close. Its leaders and most talented students were scattered across the globe, many finding refuge in the United States. Walter Gropius became the chair of architecture at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Mies van der Rohe became the director of the architecture school at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Marcel Breuer established a prolific practice in the U.S. In America, this European aesthetic style found its ultimate champion in corporate capital.
when architects Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock curated the seminal 1932 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, or the MoMA. They grouped these disparate European experiments, Bauhaus, De Style, and Le Corbusier, under a single powerful banner, the International Style. The name was a prophecy. It suggested an architectural language so neutral, so free of local color or historical reference, that it could be built anywhere, by anyone, for any purpose. This universality perfectly suited the needs of post war American corporations seeking to project a consistent, rational, and modern image across their global empires. The apex of asceticism, the Seagram Building. The ultimate American expression of the international style is Mies van der Rohe's Seagram Building in New York, 1958. It is a monument to corporate power, yet one that speaks only through absolute restraint in geometry. Every design choice in the Seagram Building is a lesson in the modernist doctrine of symbolic erasure. The plaza. Mies set the tower back from Park Avenue, creating an empty, open plaza. This negative space was more valuable than the rentable square footage it replaced. It was a gesture of profound confidence, a silent symbolic declaration that the Seagram Corporation was so powerful that it could afford to waste space. The non-load bearing bronze. The building structure is purely steel and concrete, but Mies applied non-structural bronze I-beams to the exterior facade. This is the great paradox of modernism. In the quest for truth, the architect still required a visual element to articulate the structure's rhythm and scale. These beams were functionalist ornament, a costly, meticulously crafted detail that was necessary for the eye, though redundant for the load. It was the purest possible expression of high art, controlled symbolism. Perfect proportions. The building's beauty comes not from carved figures or historical motifs, but from its perfect, almost mathematically pure proportions. The building communicated power through geometry, precision, and the sheer cost of its luxurious materials, travertine, bronze, topaz gray glass. The Seagram building symbolized the culmination of the Bauhaus ideal in America, an architecture so refined, so stripped of sentiment, that it communicated the highest form of power, unadorned, rational, and economically supreme. The cost of neutrality, the lost language. The Bauhaus revolution succeeded beyond its founders' wildest dreams. By the 1960s, the international style, the glass and steel box, was the default language of corporate, governmental, and institutional architecture across the United States. It was cheap, fast to erect, and globally recognizable. But this success came at a profound cultural cost. By stripping away the hidden language of architecture, the humanistic narratives embedded in ornamentation, modernism created buildings that were, to the average person, emotionally mute. Buildings as filing cabinets. Structures designed purely for maximum efficiency and modularity often felt cold, sterile, and inhuman. They communicated the organizational values of the corporation, but offered no comfort, historical context, or local connection to the human scale. The loss of collective memory. When a building stopped communicating stories about mythology, history, or local culture, the mainstream public stopped seeing architecture as an art form tied to collective memory. Buildings became disposable, interchangeable containers, the placeless architecture of a globalized economy. The architect's private language. The new language of the grid, the module, the joint was understood by engineers and architects, but was invisible to the public. The symbol of the gear, Art Deco, was explicit. The symbol of the structural integrity of the I-beam, modernism, was esoteric. the communication became hidden within the material science itself. The Bauhaus achieved its goal of erasing the old symbols, but in doing so, it left a void where human connection and historical continuity once resided. It ushered in an era where the architect was revered for his technical prowess, but often reviled by the public for the resulting cold, hard anonymity. The architectural landscape of America was cleansed, but the mainstream audience suddenly realized they had lost the familiar decorated world they used to inhabit. The stage was set for a massive cultural reaction, a search for ornament, color, and symbolism that would eventually manifest in the playful and often chaotic embrace of postmodernism. But for a few decades, the world belonged to the austere, silent language of the international style, where form followed function and silence was the loudest statement of all.
12. Cracks in the modern shell. Finding Old World symbols in New World skyscraper lobbies. The unkillable language. The great architectural purification of the 20th century, championed by the Bauhaus and exported globally as the international style, attempted a spiritual cleansing of the built environment. Ornament was excised, history was ignored, and the architect, rebranded as a social engineer, sought to build structures that communicated only rational efficiency. The mission was to silence the hidden language of architectural symbolism once and for all. Yet, this revolution underestimated a fundamental truth of human psychology. We are symbolic animals. We instinctively assign meaning to scale, light, rhythm, and material. An attempt to create a truly neutral space often results in creating a new symbol, one that communicates power, austerity, or alienation. Nowhere is this tension between the desire for functional purity and the persistence of symbolic meaning more evident than in the New World skyscraper lobby. The corporate headquarters, or the modern office tower, is the ultimate expression of rational, financialized architecture. Its form is dictated by floor plates, elevator cores, and property values. But the lobby, that liminal space between the dirty, chaotic street and the pressurized, ordered ascent into the corporate sky, retains the inescapable psychological function of an ancient temple, a modern basilica, or a triumphal arch. It is in these vast, expensive, often deliberately austere spaces that we find the cracks in the modern shell, where old world symbols often unintentionally seep back into the architectural grammar of the new world. The lobby as the narthex of commerce. To understand why symbolic thinking persists here, we must first define the lobby's role. It is not just a waiting room, it is a narthex, the transitional porch or entrance area of a church or basilica. Its function is ceremonial and psychological. 1. Preparation and awe. The lobby forces a change in pace. Its massive scale, high ceilings, and cool temperature slow the visitor down, demanding a moment of reverence before ascending to the heaven of the executive floors. This is the same function a narthex served, preparing the soul for the sacred space within. 2. Proclamation of authority. The structure must visually communicate the economic and legal legitimacy of the entity housed above. This requires an architecture of gravitas, which historically has always relied on the tried and true symbols of permanence, symmetry, axiality, and costly materials. 3. The axis mundi. The skyscraper itself functions as a modern axis mundi, the cosmological pillar that connects heaven and earth. The lobby, therefore, is the sacred base from which this ascent begins, defining the earthly realm where the corporate ritual is inaugurated. Even when employing minimalist forms, the architect, despite their modernist education, relies on ancient, universally recognized spatial principles to convey this authority. The return of classicism, symmetrical necessity. The most profound and often subtle return of Old World symbolism is the insistence on axial symmetry in the lobby's planning. Modernism, in its most radical phase, celebrated asymmetry, dynamism, and flowing open space. Think Frank Lloyd Wright. Yet, corporate lobbies invariably return to the most ancient of classical planning tropes: perfect bilateral symmetry. Why symmetry? Symmetry is the visual equivalent of order, stability, and justice. From the Greek temple to the Roman Forum, a symmetrical facade communicated that the power housed within was rational, balanced, and eternally stable. When a visitor enters a grand symmetrical lobby with the front desk precisely centered and two identical marble benches flanking a central aisle, their subconscious immediately processes this as a space of authority and permanence. Consider the lobby of a major financial headquarters in downtown Manhattan or Chicago. You may not find a classical column, but you will find the triumphal arch in concrete. The entrance portal, often a massive single plane opening in a glass wall, is functionally a modern triumphal arch. It provides the symbolic transition from the chaotic street into the disciplined interior. Columns in disguise. While the classical column with its capital and fluting is gone, the space is often defined by massive polished square or circular steel piers clad in stone. These piers are structural, but their rhythm and placement, often framing the central access path, perform the same visual job as a colonnade, creating rhythm, scale, and a sense of measured gravity. The symbolism of order is so essential to corporate identity that the architects, despite their modernist education, instinctively use the tools of classical Rome to achieve it. The symbolic weight of material, the new priesthood of stone. The second major crack in the modernist shell is the selective, highly symbolic use of materials, especially stone. The modernist doctrine was truth to materials. Steel was to look like steel, concrete like concrete. Yet, in the lobby, the most expensive and symbolic material on Earth, geological permanence, is almost always deployed: highly polished marble, travertine, or granite. Granite, the permanent record. Dark, often black or deep green granite used for flooring and wall cladding suggests geological time and unshakable stability. It is the material of monuments and mausoleums. In a corporate setting, it symbolically equates the company's lifespan with the lifespan of the earth itself. Travertine, the Roman echo. Travertine, famously used by Mies van der Rohe, the Seagram building lobby, immediately connects the structure back to imperial Roman architecture, the Colosseum, St. Peter's Basilica. It is not merely expensive, it is historically expensive. Its use communicates a lineage of power and civilization, implicitly linking the corporation's longevity to the legacy of ancient empires. The bronze and brass, the eternal metal. Metals used for elevator doors, security barriers, and corporate plaques are typically bronze or brass, materials that acquire a patina, suggesting age, quality, and resistance to time, unlike the sterile, often less durable aluminum or chrome. The message is clear. The architecture may be minimalist, but the material speaks volumes, silently declaring what is built here is meant to last forever. The choice of material becomes the only permissible form of symbolic ornamentation. Light as divine and corporate emanation. In traditional religious architecture, from Egyptian temples to Gothic cathedrals, light was the single most powerful symbol, representing divinity, revelation, and the presence of the transcendent. Modern skyscraper lobbies, with their vast scale and deep-set interiors, also treat light not just as illumination, but as a symbolic medium, often echoing ancient practices. The Oculus effect. In lobbies that feature large, central recessed light fixtures or ceiling features, the design often recreates the effect of the oculus, the circular opening in the dome of the Pantheon. This focused, descending beam of light draws the eye upward, emphasizes the central axis, and instills a sense of the sublime or the sacred descending upon the space. The light is not diffused. It is channeled and directed to define space and highlight the visitor's path. The wall of light, the corporate iconostasis. In many modern towers, the entire glass curtain wall facing the street is treated as a vast screen of light, particularly at night. This transparent facade acts as a glowing iconostasis, the screen of icons separating the sanctuary from the nave in Eastern Orthodox churches. The corporate logo, subtly lit, is placed as the central icon on a dark granite wall bathed in light that emanates from the building's own power grid. The message shifts from divine light to corporate energy and omnipresence. This manipulation of light ensures that the lobby, though structurally secular, retains the psychological weight of a spiritual space. The unintentional ziggurat, verticality and transcendence. The most fundamental symbolic echo is the form of the skyscraper itself. It is the modern manifestation of the ancient ziggurat, the massive stepped structure built by Mesopotamians to literally reach closer to the gods. The drive for verticality is not purely economic, though height certainly implies land value. It is also a symbolic and competitive expression of human ambition and the conquest of the vertical plane. When one enters the base of a modern skyscraper, the lobby's immense, often disproportionate height, the cathedral effect, reinforces the symbolic journey. The ceiling heights are often dramatically increased, sometimes 20 to 30 feet, purely for psychological impact, dwarfing the visitor and emphasizing the scale of the power they are approaching. The experience of passing through the lobby and stepping into the high-speed elevator is a highly formalized, ritualistic ascent. Number 1, Earth. Street level. Chaos, noise, humanity. Number 2, liminal space. Lobby. Order, silence, transition, material permanence. Number 3, ascension. Rapid, frictionless removal from the earthly realm. Number 4, heaven. Executive floor. Quiet, panoramic views, purified air, and executive power. This architectural narrative, the conquest of gravity and the symbolic journey from earth to sky, is the same narrative structure that underpinned all great monumental architecture of the Old World, now simply repurposed for the narrative of global finance and technology. Postmodernism, when the cracks became deliberate. The inherent symbolic muteness of high modernism eventually created a cultural exhaustion. The public craved recognition and visual communication that went beyond the neutral box. The cracks in the modern shell widened into deliberate ruptures with the advent of postmodernism in the 1970s and 80s. Postmodern architecture explicitly rejected the dogma of function over form and intentionally brought back the suppressed hidden language. A prime example is Philip Johnson's ATT building, now Sony Tower in New York City, 1984. Its famous, controversial Chippendale pediment, a massive, symbolic decorative element placed atop the structure, was a flagrant act of symbolic defiance. But the lobby itself,
though using modernist materials, features a massive arched portico entrance reminiscent of a Roman bath or basilica. The broken pediment symbol. The open pediment was a direct, playful, and aggressive reference to classical history, acting as a deliberate symbol, almost shouting, "We are allowed to have ornament again." Reconciling the past, postmodernist architects argued that architecture should communicate with the public using familiar classical language, not just the esoteric language of engineering. They gave permission for the architect to become a decorator and a narrator once more. While postmodernism itself eventually faded, its fundamental lesson that the public demands meaning, narrative, and symbol was absorbed into contemporary design. Today's high design lobbies often blend the minimalism of modernism with the narrative elements of postmodernism, using custom art installations, deliberate lighting choreography, and sculptural symbolic furniture to give the space a unique, memorable, and often historically informed soul. The most effective modern lobbies are those that understand the fundamental truth. The Bauhaus could remove the form of the column, but it could not remove the human need for the symbol of authority and permanence the column represented. The architecture of the New World skyscraper lobby, therefore, is not a failure of modernism, but a powerful testament to the unshakable longevity of Old World symbolic thought. The ancient language of hierarchy, procession, and permanence simply shed its classical robes and donned the polished glass and granite uniform of the contemporary corporation. The language is hidden, but it is speaking all the same.
13. The preservationist's plea, the race to document the language before renovation erases the text. The erasing hand of time and budget. The story of the modern skyscraper is often told as a triumph of engineering and finance, but for Dr. Lena Hansen, an architectural historian at the Getty Conservation Institute, it is a story of silent, profound loss. For the last 5 years, she has directed the Lobby Language Documentation Project, LLDP, an underfunded, desperate race against the clock to record the subtle, symbolic grammar embedded in America's post-war commercial towers before corporate renovation cycles erase the text forever. Lena knows that the purest modernist lobby, sheathed in the finest Miesian glass and granite, is as fragile as any gilded Rococo interior. Why? Because the modern structure, governed by quarterly earnings and 10-year leases, is built not to last physically, but to be eternally renovated aesthetically. The great enemy of symbolism is not the rival architectural school, but the corporate mandate for agile, digital, and collaborative aesthetics. The moment a building hits 30 years, the lobby, the most public-facing, image-defining space, is deemed dated. The goal of these modern renovations is the systematic de-symbolization of the architecture. The heavy geologic marble that speaks of permanence is ripped out and replaced with lightweight drywall and ephemeral digital screens. The axial, processional path of authority is broken up by whimsical seating pods and temporary pop-up retail areas. The lobby is transformed from a narthex of commerce into a WeWork light airport lounge. They aren't just replacing a desk, Lena often tells her small team. They are eliminating the verb of the building. They're erasing the statement of permanence and replacing it with the placeholder of trendiness. When you swap travertine for laminate, you don't save money, you change the meaning of the enterprise housed above. Reading the cracked code. Lena's work focuses on the symbols that are not overtly classical, the unintended echoes of old world design. Her team uses a forensic approach, documenting 3 core elements: geological material, light choreography, and spatial rhythm. 1. The priesthood of stone, reading the geologic text. Her most critical work involves the stone. In 1980s towers, marble was often cut in vast, book-matched panels. This technique, where two adjacent slabs of stone from the same block are opened and laid facing each other, creates a near-perfect symmetrical mirror image of the stone's natural veining. The symbol. This book matching technique is a deliberate, expensive choice that elevates the natural chaos of the earth into a symmetrical, ordered pattern. It's an ancient symbol of divine harmony and cosmic balance, mirroring the bilateral symmetry found in sacred geometry and the human body. The thread. When a tenant installation requires just one hole to be drilled for a cable, that single book-matched panel is often damaged. Since the specific quarry or block of stone has long been exhausted, the damage is irreparable. In a typical renovation, the cost of sourcing a similar stone is too high, so the entire wall is often covered with paint or digital wallpaper, destroying the visual harmony and the geologic text. Lena Skeen meticulously records the geometry of the book-matched panels using LiDAR and high-resolution photography, preserving the pattern even if the stone itself is lost. 2. The axis mundi. Mapping the invisible path. In the early international-style towers of the 1950s and 60s, explicit symbolism was utterly forbidden. Yet Lena found that the architects simply transferred the symbolic weight onto the elevator core. The elevator core, the building's spine, is the source of all movement and power. The lobby floor plan is universally structured to lead the visitor from the street to this core. The symbol. The path from the entrance, across the lobby, and into the elevator car creates a perfect processional axis. This path replicates the design of a Roman via sacra, or sacred way, or the nave of a cathedral, a path of ritual and purification leading to the Holy of Holies, in this case, the executive offices. The path is emphasized by flanking elements, art, light sconces, or even just changes in flooring reflectivity that reinforce the centrality of the axis. The lobby is transformed from a narthex of commerce into a WeWork light airport lounge. The case of the obsolete security desk. The most common point of symbolic destruction centers on the original reception security desk. In the original postmodern towers, 1980s, the desk was almost always a massive, immovable sculpture, a granite block, often circular or hexagonal, placed dead center, radiating authority. It was the modern interpretation of a central altar or dais, a physical barrier that demanded acknowledgement. One of Lena's key battles was documenting the lobby of the Viridian Tower in Dallas. Its 1982 desk was a perfect circle, clad in black and silver granite, and raised on a low step. That desk was a keystone, Lena explains in her report. It wasn't just a place to check IDs, it was the psychological anchor of the room. It was where the visitors submitted to the authority of the building. The circular form echoed the rotunda, the classical gathering point. It demanded a moment of hesitation and attention. The new owners, a tech firm, wanted flow. They removed the altar-like granite desk, replacing it with two small, mobile, white plastic podiums and a set of automated turnstiles. The effect was immediate. The space lost its center, becoming a fast-moving corridor rather than a place of entrance and transition. The symbolic anchor of the building was gone. Lena's team, working over a long weekend before demolition, created a 3D laser scan of the entire lobby, ensuring the granite desk's geometry was recorded precisely, down to the millimeter. They preserved the object's symbolic intent, if not the object itself. The race against digital ephemera. Another subtle but persistent symbol that is rapidly being eliminated is the use of fixed, permanent bronze signage.
In older lobbies, the list of major tenants, often engraved in bronze or etched into granite, was placed adjacent to the elevator bank. This list functioned as a modern corporate roll of honor, placing the occupying companies into a hierarchy of importance, suggesting permanence and the legal weight of their tenancy. The symbol. The use of metal and permanent etching suggests a long term contract with the building and, by extension, society. It is the architectural equivalent of an engraved tombstone, a commitment to lasting presence. The threat. The engraved list is universally replaced by a scrolling digital directory board. The digital screen is cheap, easy to update, and perfectly communicates the ephemeral, volatile nature of the modern economy. A tenant can be listed one day and removed the next with a software update. The symbolism has shifted from permanence to transaction. Lena argues that documenting the design of the original directory, the typeface, the spacing, the heavy bronze material, is crucial to understanding the building's original psychological contract with its inhabitants. The philosophical plea. Lena Hansen's project isn't about saving old furniture, it's about preserving civic memory. We tear down these lobbies and we think we're just updating the light fixtures, but we're actually performing a lobotomy on the city's collective consciousness. These spaces, though secular, are the new public square, the site of our most important modern rituals: the securing of capital, the pursuit of commerce, the demonstration of technological power. The symbols, whether the perfect symmetry of the marble or the commanding height of the ceiling, were the architect's subtle pleas to the visitor. Take us seriously. This is important. This is stable. When the renovation replaces that gravitas with the easily changeable, the ephemeral, and the intentionally casual, the building ceases to be a monument and becomes a mere container. The symbolic language that reassured the tenant, impressed the client, and conveyed the institutional authority of the corporation is silenced. The LLDP's final goal is not merely a digital archive. Lena hopes to create a symbolic intent guide that, when a building is slated for renovation, forces the new design team to acknowledge the original intent of the space, the rhythm, the axis, the material weight, before they destroy it. For Lena Hansen, the work is never finished. Every morning brings a new building permit, a new demolition notice, and a new race to get the LiDAR scanner and the camera into a lobby before the last subtle whisper of old world authority is plastered over, painted white, and replaced by the scrolling, meaningless content of a 4K digital screen. The text is fading, and the clock is always ticking. The question is not how much she can save, but how much she can record before the language becomes intelligible to future generations. The preservationist plea is simply this: let us read the text before you burn the book. 14. The symbol's resonance. Why ancient geometry still speaks to the modern American psyche. The invisible contract. For Dr. Alistair Finch, a cultural semiotician based in San Francisco, the work of Lena Hansen and her preservationists was a godsend. While Lena was focused on what was being destroyed, the physical text, Alistair was obsessed with why it worked in the first place, the subconscious grammar. Alistair's life work was the study of limbic architecture, the theory that the core elements of the built environment bypass rational thought and speak directly to the brain's oldest structures, particularly those governing safety, hierarchy, and purpose. The modern corporate lobby, Alistair argued in his seminal and largely ignored 2018 paper, The Cathedral of Commerce, was the most powerful secular ritual space in contemporary American life, and its power lay not in its expensive materials, but in its absolute reliance on universal geometric truths,
forms that have been speaking the same language since the first stones of Stonehenge were laid. Alistair saw the lobby as the ultimate American contradiction, a space dedicated to the chaotic, fluid, ephemeral pursuit of the market, yet designed with the geometric rigor of an Egyptian tomb, whispering promises of eternal order and stability. The architect, whether he studied at the Beaux Arts or the Bauhaus, is a medium. He is channeling the collective subconscious. He builds stability into the very walls because we, the inhabitants, cannot tolerate the full, terrifying truth of capitalism that nothing is permanent. The symbols are not a choice, they are an unavoidable, necessary psychological defense. The average American entering one of these grand lobbies, seeking a job, closing a deal, or simply delivering a package, does not consciously think, a perfect circle, the ancient symbol of totality and the sun. But their unconscious does. That is the resonance. The tyranny of the circle. Total order versus market chaos. The circle is arguably the most dominant symbolic form in corporate architecture, manifesting in massive circular reception desks, rotunda ceilings, and the rounded geometry of the building footprint itself. The archetype. The circle represents wholeness, unity, eternity, and the self, the Jungian mandala. It is the form of the eye, the sun, the planetary orbit, a perfect self-contained system with no beginning or end. It is the ultimate antidote to entropy. The resonance in America. Why does this form work so powerfully in the US? Because the national character is defined by the friction between freedom and order. Americans crave the dynamism and chaotic opportunity of the free market, the line moving ever forward, yet they recoil from the psychological insecurity it generates. When a client walks into a lobby dominated by a massive, perfect circular desk, a geological drum made of a million-year-old stone, the limbic system receives an immediate deep message. This center holds. The chaos outside, the stock market volatility, the political instability, it cannot penetrate this circle. The original architects, often trained in classical proportion, may have been believing they were just creating an efficient hub for security and circulation. But Alistair argued they were creating a secular altar. The circular form transforms the receptionist from a mere employee into the high priestess of the portal, standing at the center of the firmament, controlling access to the corporate cosmos above. It grounds the space and the individual in an illusion of immutable stability. The modern renovation, which replaces this stone drum with a mobile, curved desk of white plastic, something that can be rolled away for a cocktail party, does more than just update the look. It literally decenters the world. It tells the visitor, unconsciously, that the hub is temporary, the order is negotiable, and the business itself might be only temporary. The symbol is broken, and the psychological contract is voided. The gospel of the triangle, the ascent, and the hierarchy. If the circle is the anchor of stability, the triangle, often expressed in the vertical thrust of the building, the setbacks that create a pyramidal effect, or the geometric ceiling coffers, is the symbol of ascent and hierarchy. The archetype. The triangle, particularly pointing upward, represents stability, purpose, and the divine path to greater knowledge or power. From the Egyptian pyramids to the Christian Trinity, it embodies the structure of authority and the arduous journey upward. It is the symbol that justifies hierarchy. The resonance in America. The American myth is defined by verticality and progress. It is a story of getting ahead, of scaling the corporate ladder, of manifest destiny applied to the skyscraper. The inherent belief that the highest point is the best point. When an individual enters a corporate tower, they are immediately placed at the bottom of a colossal inverted concrete pyramid. The entire design vocabulary, the towering vertical mullions, the way the light catches the structural beams, the elevator core that offers a frictionless, rapid ascent, reinforces the powerful, universal narrative of the upward struggle. The usurat setbacks.
These architectural features, required for light and air, were unintentionally mirroring the ancient Mesopotamian ziggurat, a structure built specifically to bring the priests closer to the heavens. In the modern tower, the setbacks signal the varying levels of power and exclusivity, culminating in the highest executive office, the modern day high priest. The lobby Kefering, Alistair studied, the triangular and tetrahedral coffered ceilings popular in 1980s lobbies, these shapes, when viewed from below, create an overwhelming sense of structure and repetition. They don't just hold the roof up, they visually compress the visitor, emphasizing their low position and underscoring the powerful, complex geometry that governs the space above them. The triangle gives the corporate structure a divine, preordained legitimacy. It assures the supplicant that the hierarchy they are about to encounter is not arbitrary, but logical, stable, and justified by geometry itself.
The axis mundi, the straight line of American purpose. Lena's team focused on the axis mundi, the straight path from the street to the elevator core. Alistair saw this as the psychological engine of the entire ritual. The archetype. The straight axial path represents destiny, ritual, and singleness of purpose. It is the path walked by the Roman general after a triumph, the pilgrim approaching a shrine, or the hunter tracking prey. It removes doubt and focuses energy. The resonance in America. The American identity is tied to the concept of the straight shot. From the grid-based city plan to the interstate highway system, there is a cultural obsession with directness, efficiency, and the purposeful, unhindered journey toward a goal. The meandering European garden or the chaotic Asian alleyway is anathema to this mindset. The lobby's axial path leverages this cultural bias. When the visitor is visually and physically guided by a straight path, flanked by symmetrical columns or identical marble walls, their attention is intensely focused. All distractions are minimized. The design communicates, you are here for one purpose. You will move efficiently toward the power center. This forced procession is a subtle, nonverbal psychological preparation. It is the building stripping away the chaos of the city streets and imposing its own ritualistic rhythm. It compels the visitor to adopt a serious, focused, and purposeful demeanor before they reach the security checkpoint. Renovations often attempt to soften this severity by adding curvilinear furniture arrangements, planters, and meandering paths to encourage collaboration or relaxation. But to Alistair, this is symbolic vandalism. It breaks the sacred path of purpose, substituting it for the aimless wandering of a shopping mall. It tells the visitor that their purpose is secondary to the convenience of the moment, disrupting the deep-seated psychological need for a clear, defined destiny. The unavoidable language. Alistair's final philosophical conclusion was that the symbolic resonance of these lobbies is unavoidable. It is not a learned language, it is an instinctual one. He theorized that the human mind is essentially a pattern recognition engine, and the simplest geometric forms, the line, the circle, the triangle, are the first patterns we master. They are the keys to understanding the structure of the universe, and we project their properties, eternity, stability, and purpose, onto anything that uses them consistently and at scale. When you enter a lobby, Alistair wrote in his closing remarks, you are engaging in a dialogue with the building that is using a language 10,000 years older than the corporation it houses. The intent of the CEO was irrelevant. The cost of the marble is secondary. What matters is that the circle still whispers of the sun, the triangle still points to the heavens, and the axis still commands us forward. The renovation architects are trying to modernize the language, replacing Latin with emoji. But when you replace the eternal forms with the trendy and ephemeral, you don't just change the building's mood. You reduce its capacity to reassure. You eliminate its ability to tap into that deep,
fundamental American need for ordered stability in the face of absolute, market driven chaos. The fight to document these symbols, led by people like Dr. Hansen, is not a fight for historical accuracy. It is a fight for the preservation of our psychological scaffolding. If we erase the language that promises order, what is left to protect us from the truth of the void? Alistair closed his presentation with an image of a digitized, abstract pattern on a new lobby's LED screen, replacing a book-matched marble wall. The digital pattern was fluid, randomized, and constantly changing. This, he said, pointing to the screen, is the ultimate de-symbolization. It is the architect's surrender. It speaks no language at all. It is only noise. The room remained silent, filled with the collective uncomfortable realization that the fight to save the old symbols was a fight to save the last necessary illusions of order in the modern world. The old language still spoke, and it was the only one that truly mattered.
To read the city, an invitation to become fluent in the hidden language of stone and steel. The documentation was finished. Dr. Lena Hansen, blinking against the artificial light of her converted warehouse office, looked at the final report. It wasn't a policy brief, it was a museum of the intangible. Each digital file contained the spectral essence of a space that might soon be gone. The perfect curvature of a marble rotunda, the relentless verticality of a 1970s banking tower, the sacred symmetry of an axial lobby path. Alistair Finch, the semiotician, had given her the vocabulary. Lena had provided the visual grammar. Together, they had proved the invisible premise that every square mile of the American city, from the gleaming corporate plaza to the mundane suburban street, was not merely a collection of structures, but a massive, living text written in the oldest human language, geometry. The wrecking balls still swung. Corporations still prioritized cheap, temporary, disposable aesthetics over the enduring power of archetype. The fight to save specific buildings was a constant, exhausting battle against the currents of capital. But the core of their project had shifted. It was no longer about saving the stone, it was about saving the site. The real victory, they realized, would not be in a court injunction, but in a mass awakening, a moment when millions of ordinary Americans, going about their day, suddenly saw the profound, ancient symbolism embedded in the steel and glass, and recognized the invisible psychological contract the architecture was attempting to impose. This is your invitation to that awakening. The moment of sight. Imagine you are standing at the entrance of a major metropolitan bank, or perhaps a regional university library built in the 1980s. You've walked this path 1,000 times. It's just the entrance. But now, look closer. Before you saw paving stones and planters. Now you see the axis mundi, the dead straight line imposing singular purpose and directing your gaze unerringly toward the inner sanctum. The line extending from the street, through the columns, past the security guard, and ending exactly at the central elevator core is not about convenience. It is a ritual path designed to purge the chaos of the outside world and enforce the seriousness of place. Before you saw a circular information desk, now you see the mandala, the perfect circle speaking of completeness, eternity, and a stable, self-contained universe. Its message bypasses your rational mind and whispers to your limbic system. You are safe here. This organization has no beginning and no end. Its order is total. Before you saw a glass skyscraper, now you see the pyramid, the triumphant,
upward-pointing triangle, relentlessly reinforcing the primal human story of hierarchy, ascent, and striving. It commands you to look up, to acknowledge the pinnacle of power, and to internalize the vertical struggle that defines the American dream. This is your invitation to that awakening. The grammar of the everyday. The ancient language of stone and steel is not reserved for monumental corporate architecture. It is the invisible grammar of your everyday life, shaping your perceptions, dictating your movement, and conditioning your emotional response to the spaces you inhabit. To become fluent in this language, you must apply the three core symbols, circle, line, triangle, to the most common yet overlooked landscapes of the American experience. Number 1. The circle of comfort, decoding the suburb. The suburbs, built on the promise of escape and stability, rely heavily on the circle. The cul-de-sac. The quintessential American suburban street plan is a chaos of short, curving dead ends. The cul-de-sac is literally bottom of the bag, is a physical residential mandala. The symbolism. It is designed to be a complete self-referential world. It creates a defensible perimeter, minimizes external traffic chaos, and reinforces the local immediate community, wholeness. It tells the resident, your world is here, contained, safe, and circular. It tells the resident, your world is here, contained, safe, and circular. It encourages insularity and belonging. Its circularity is a rejection of the outward striving, linear ambition of the city grid. In a nation obsessed with going forward, the cul-de-sac is an architectural statement about standing still. The loop of the big box store. The parking lot of any massive American retail chain is often an enormous loop, a path that forces customers to enter, circulate, and exit in a predetermined flow. This is the retail circle of endless return. The path dictates the journey, keeping the consumer within the transactional loop until they complete the ritual of purchase. It is the psychological counterpart to the corporate rotunda, but dedicated not to corporate stability, but to consumer persistence. When you drive through your neighborhood or park at the grocery store, ask yourself, is this geometry offering me escape or demanding my containment? Number 2, the line of escape, decoding the interstate. If the circle defines containment, the straight line defines destiny, mobility, and the core American belief in unhindered progress. This is the language of the interstate. The highway grid, the massive, unrelenting straight lines of American highways cutting across ancient landscapes and disrupting natural geography, are the most powerful expressions of the axis mundi. The symbolism? The straight line of the highway is a monument to efficiency and individual purpose. It is the literal manifestation of manifest destiny, replacing natural curving rivers and trails with a direct technological vector toward a goal. It tells the driver, doubt is waste. Your path is clear and unhindered. The psychological effect? It induces a state of focused, almost hypnotic trance, where the goal becomes paramount and the journey itself is minimized. When you drive, you are participating in a vast national ritual of linear striving. The strip mall facade. The long, flat, horizontal line of the ubiquitous American strip mall is the commercial equivalent of the highway, a line of pure, unadorned function. The symbolism. It offers immediate sequential access, no hierarchy, no vertical ambition, just one functional box after another. It speaks of transaction, not transcendence. It is the anti-cathedral, prioritizing speed and accessibility over psychological authority. By noticing the line, you begin to understand where the city wants you to go, how fast it wants you to move, and the purpose it has assigned to your journey.
3. The triangle of transaction, decoding the public square. The triangle, the symbol of ascent and hierarchy, governs the places where power is displayed or exchanged, often masked by accessibility. The courthouse steps. Every old county courthouse, city hall, or monumental government building stands atop a flight of steps, a literal, stable, concrete triangle. The symbolism. The steps are the architectural justification for the law and the hierarchy it represents. The act of ascending the triangle physically reinforces the gravity and authority of the institution. You must rise to meet the law. It will not descend to you. It is a visual cue. Authority resides above you. The psychological effect. It instills respect and sometimes trepidation before the encounter with power even begins. This is why modern municipal buildings that are flat and flush with the street often feel less imposing and more approachable. The geometric justification for hierarchy has been removed. The corporate atrium. While the main lobby features the mandala, the internal soaring atria of many headquarters often utilize massive diagonal beams, crisscrossing trusses, and inverted pyramids in their ceiling design. The symbolism. This complex triangular netting speaks of engineered stability. It assures the employees and visitors that the immense weight of the building and the organization is managed by a complex, high-level, and perfectly rational system. It is the technical justification for the corporate mission. The triangle reveals the power structure. It shows you who was high, who was low, and the prescribed path between them. The philosophical defense. Why does this matter? Why become fluent in this hidden language? Because it is a form of philosophical self-defense. The architects and developers who replace the eternal, archetypal forms with the trendy, disposable, and chaotic are not just making aesthetic choices. They are dismantling the deep psychological contracts that allow human beings to navigate the world with a sense of order. When a builder replaces a massive, single-axis mundi with a meandering, curved path, they're saying, we have no singular overriding purpose. The visitor hears, your purpose here is negotiable. When a renovation replaces the heavy geological circle of the marble desk with the light, modular, temporary table, they are saying, this center is not permanent. The visitor hears, the order is temporary. Stability is an illusion. You, the symbolically literate reader, gain immunity to this passive manipulation. You gain the ability to strip away the veneer of glass and branding and see the ancient code underneath. When you recognize the circle, you can appreciate its deep human message of wholeness, even if the corporation that built it is shallow and fragmented. When you see the triangle of the courthouse, you can respect the necessary authority it embodies, even if the decision makers within are flawed. The intent of the builder, as Alistair argued, is irrelevant. They may only be chasing profit or prestige, but the power of the universal forms, circles, triangles, spirals, and lines continue to resonate with people, tapping into fundamental human concepts of order and chaos. This resonance is your inheritance. It is the collective memory of humanity's first struggle to impose structure on a wild world. It is the enduring proof that we are creatures who crave pattern and meaning. Your call to action. Dr. Lena Hansen's fight showed that the language of stone and steel is an endangered one. The rapid pace of modernization, driven by short-term gains,
is erasing the stable, ancient syntax and replacing it with temporary noise. Your mission is not to stop the inevitable change, but to preserve the knowledge. Your call to action is simple. Start reading. 1. Stop and look up. The next time you enter a new building, or one you know well, stop. Ignore the signage, the posters, and the colors. Focus only on the geometry. 2. Identify the core symbols. Where is the line directing you? What does the circle contain? What does the triangle elevate? 3. Translate the message. Translate the symbol's meaning into a psychological message. Line equals purpose, circle equals stability, triangle equals hierarchy. What is this space telling you about your role within it? 4. Connect to the past. Recognize that in seeing these forms, you are engaging in the exact same pattern recognition that guided the hands that built the pyramids and Stonehenge. You are fluent in the oldest language. The city is not just a place where you work and live. It is a profound historical document that you are walking through every day. It contains the history of human aspiration, the architecture of our power structures, and the map of our collective desires for order and escape. The preservationists saved the text. The semioticists taught us the vocabulary. Now, it is up to you to become fluent. The city is waiting to be read. Pick up the symbols and let the stones speak.